Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Gila Wilderness of southwestern New Mexico, near the ancient cliff dwellings that have watched over the Middle Fork Gila River for 8 centuries. David Jones and I had been planning this backpacking trip for months. We both needed to escape, him from his recent divorce, me from the suffocating grief that had followed my younger brother's death in a climbing accident 6 months prior. The Gila seemed perfect, 558,114 acres of untouched wilderness, the largest roadless area in New Mexico, where we could disappear for a week and maybe find ourselves again. We met at the Gila Visitor Center in Silver City on a Tuesday morning in early October. David looked older than his 34 years, stress lines etched deep around his eyes, his usually perfect hair unkempt. I probably looked worse. I'd lost 20 pounds since Jake's funeral and hadn't been sleeping well. "You sure about this, Mike?" David asked as we loaded our packs from his Jeep. "It's pretty remote out there. No cell service for days." I shouldered my 60-pound pack, feeling the familiar weight of my gear. That's exactly what I need right now. Our planned route would take us along the middle fork of the Gila River, past the cliff dwellings, then north toward the Jerky Mountains before looping back. 7 days, 6 nights, roughly 40 miles of some of the most isolated country in the lower 48. The trailhead at the end of Forest Road 15 was empty except for an old Ford pickup with New Mexico plates. A handwritten note tucked under the windshield wiper fluttered in the desert wind. David glanced at it as we passed. "Back in 5 days. If not, check the high country," he read aloud. Cheerful, the first few miles followed the river through stands of cottonwood and willow, their leaves a brilliant gold against the rust-colored canyon walls. The Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument sat like ancient eyes in the limestone faces above us, rooms carved into the rock by Mogollon people who had vanished centuries ago. I'd read that they'd abandoned the area suddenly, leaving behind pottery and tools as if they'd fled in the middle of daily life. "Look at that," David said, pointing up at the dwellings. "Imagine living up there. Wonder why they left. Drought, maybe, or something scared them off." By late afternoon, we'd hiked 8 miles upstream to our first camp near Catfish Hole, a deep pool where the river bent sharply north. The canyon walls rose nearly 200 feet on either side, creating an amphitheater of stone that caught and held every sound. We set up our tents on a gravel bar thick with willows, the sound of running water masking the profound silence that seemed to press down from the desert above. As darkness fell, that silence became oppressive. In the city, you forget what real quiet sounds like. Here, every snap of the fire, every rustle of fabric seemed amplified. I found myself straining to hear something beyond the river's murmur. Footsteps, voices, anything human. "Jesus, it's dark out here," David said, poking at our fire with a stick. The flames cast dancing shadows on the canyon walls, and for a moment I could swear I saw movement in the cliff dwellings above us. "No light pollution," I said, though my voice sounded strained even to me. "You don't realize how much the city lights wash out until you're somewhere like this." David was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Sarah used to love camping, before everything went to shit. His wife had left him after she found out about his affair, a cliché that had destroyed a 10-year marriage. "You'll get through it," I said, though the words felt hollow. I was hardly one to offer advice about moving forward. That first night, I lay in my tent listening to sounds I couldn't identify. The river provided a constant backdrop, but there were other noises, scraping sounds from the canyon walls, what might have been footsteps on gravel, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When I finally dozed around 3 a.m., I dreamed of my brother Jake falling, his scream echoing off canyon walls that stretched infinitely upward. I woke to David shaking my tent. "Mike, get up, something's wrong." I unzipped my sleeping bag, immediately hit by the morning chill. "What is it?" "The fire. Look at the fire." Our campfire from the night before had been reduced to cold ashes. Normal enough. But the ashes formed a perfect circle, and in the center, someone had arranged our eating utensils in a complex geometric pattern. The metal spoons and forks caught the early light like some kind of ritual mandala. "Did you do this?" David asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "No. Did you?" We stared at the arrangement. Neither of us was the type for practical jokes, especially not David in his current state. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate to be random. The utensils formed interlocking triangles within the circle, and looking at it gave me an uneasy feeling, like staring at an optical illusion that hurt your eyes. "Maybe an animal," I suggested, though it sounded ridiculous even as I said it. "Raccoons are smart. They could have—" "Raccoons don't arrange silverware, Mike." We broke camp quickly, neither of us wanting to discuss what we'd found. But as we packed, I noticed other small wrongnesses. David's hiking boots had been moved about 3 feet from where he'd left them, positioned precisely parallel to each other. The zipper on my bear canister had been turned exactly 180 degrees from where I'd set it the night before. The second day's hike took us deeper into the wilderness, away from the tourist area around the cliff dwellings and into country where the only trails were game paths and the occasional cairn left by previous backpackers. The canyon walls grew higher and more twisted, creating a labyrinth of side canyons and hidden alcoves. We passed hot springs where mineralized water had painted the rocks in sheets of orange and yellow, and David joked that it looked like the earth was bleeding. "Cheerful," I said, echoing his comment from the day before, but I was starting to feel it too, a sense that the landscape itself was somehow hostile. The rock formations seemed to watch us pass, and every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. When the wind picked up, it carried sounds that didn't belong. What might have been voices, or crying, or laughter. Always just at the edge of hearing, always impossible to identify. We camped that night near Jordan Hot Springs, where sulfurous water bubbled up from deep underground. The smell of rotten eggs hung in the air, and David complained that it made everything taste wrong. Our dinner, our water, even the air itself. "Maybe we should head back," he said as we sat by our fire. "This place gives me the creeps." I looked around at the canyon walls looming black against the stars. In daylight, they'd been rust red and gold, beautiful in their starkness. Now they felt like the walls of a trap closing slowly around us. "We're barely 2 days in," I said. "Besides, the way out is just as long as the way forward now." "I know, but—" David paused, poking at the fire. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" I did, but admitting it felt like giving in to paranoia. "It's just the isolation getting to you. City boys like us, we're not used to this much quiet." But that night, the quiet was broken by sounds that definitely didn't belong. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by what sounded like someone walking around our camp. Slow, measured footsteps on the gravel. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to the footsteps circle my tent once, twice, 3 times. Then they stopped directly outside my tent wall. I could hear breathing, slow, deep breaths that seemed too loud, too deliberate. After several minutes that felt like hours, the footsteps moved away, heading toward David's tent. I heard the same circling pattern, the same measured breathing. In the morning, David looked haggard, dark circles under his eyes. "Did you hear that last night?" he asked. "Hear what?" "The walking. Someone was walking around our camp all night." I was about to tell him about my own experience when we found the tracks. In the soft sand near the hot springs, clear as photographs, were footprints. They circled both our tents exactly as I'd heard, but something was wrong with them. They were human-shaped but too long, the toes too sharp, the heel too narrow, and there were no prints leading to or away from our camp, just the circles around our tents as if whatever made them had appeared and vanished without crossing the surrounding ground. "What the hell kind of animal makes tracks like that?" David asked, crouching down to examine them more closely. I knelt beside him, my unease growing into genuine fear. The tracks were pressed deep into the sand, suggesting something heavy, but the shape was all wrong. "I don't know. Maybe we should—" A sound from behind us made us both spin around. From somewhere up in the rocks came a low, rhythmic chanting. The words were impossible to make out, but the cadence was hypnotic, rising and falling like a tide. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls until the whole gorge resonated with the sound. Then it stopped, cut off so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. "What the fuck was that?" David whispered. I was scanning the rocks above us, looking for any sign of movement. The canyon walls were riddled with caves and alcoves, any of which could hide someone watching us. "I don't know. Maybe we're near a reservation, and someone's performing a ceremony." Out here, in the middle of nowhere? But even as I said it, I knew it didn't feel right. The chanting had been wrong, somehow. Not sacred, but hungry. It had made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. We packed up quickly and started hiking, both of us eager to put distance between ourselves and whatever had visited our camp. But as we hiked deeper into the wilderness, the wrongness seemed to follow us. Our GPS started giving impossible readings, showing us in places we'd never been, or sometimes not showing our location at all. The compass needle spun wildly, never settling on magnetic north. "Electronics glitch," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "The rock formations here probably have a lot of iron ore." David pulled out our paper map, but when he unfolded it, we both stared in confusion. The topographic lines seemed to shift and blur when we weren't looking directly at them. Features that should have been there, the hot springs we'd just left, the confluence of two streams we'd crossed that morning, simply weren't marked. "This isn't right," David said, turning the map around. "This isn't our map." But it was. I could see his penciled notes in the margins, my own route markings in red ink. It was definitely our map, but the landscape it showed was subtly wrong, as if someone had taken our familiar route and twisted it just enough to make it alien. "Maybe we're just tired," I said, "not seeing things clearly." But I knew that wasn't it. Something was happening to us out here, something that went beyond fatigue or stress. The wilderness itself seemed to be changing around us, becoming something hostile and strange. That third night, we camped in a narrow canyon barely wide enough for our two tents. The walls rose so high on either side that we could only see a thin strip of sky, scattered with stars that seemed dimmer than they should be. Neither of us slept well. I kept waking to the sound of voices, sometimes David calling my name, sometimes strangers having conversations just outside our camp. But when I'd listen carefully, the voices would fade into the wind moving through the rocks. Around 3 a.m., I heard David's tent zipper opening. Footsteps moved away from camp heading downstream. After 15 minutes, I began to worry. I called out softly, "David, you okay?" No answer. I waited another 10 minutes, then unzipped my tent and peered out. David's tent was empty, the sleeping bag unzipped from the inside. His boots were gone, but his flashlight was still there, sitting right where he'd left it. I called his name louder, hearing my voice echo off the canyon walls. Nothing. I pulled on my boots and grabbed my headlamp, following the only route he could have taken, downstream along the creek bed. The beam of my light carved a weak tunnel through the darkness, creating more shadows than it eliminated. Every boulder looked like a crouching figure, every tree like someone standing motionless in the dark. I found him 20 minutes later, standing waist-deep in a beaver pond about half a mile from camp. He was perfectly still, facing away from me, his arms hanging loose at his sides. The water around him was black as oil in my headlamp beam. "David," I called out. "What are you doing?" He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. I waded into the pond, the icy water shocking my system awake. When I reached him, I grabbed his shoulder and turned him around. His eyes were open but empty, pupils dilated so wide they looked black. He was staring through me as if I wasn't there. His skin was cold, too cold, and when I touched his face, he didn't blink. "David, can you hear me?" For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice that was almost his, but somehow flatter, more hollow, he said, "The water is warm here." But it wasn't. The water was freezing, mountain runoff that made my legs ache with cold. I shook him gently. "Come on, we need to get back to camp. You're hypothermic." He blinked slowly, and for a moment something like recognition flickered in his eyes. "Mike, what? Where are we?" "You were sleepwalking. Come on, let's get you dry and warm." I led him back to camp, but he moved like someone in a trance, stumbling over rocks he should have easily seen, stopping randomly to stare at nothing. When we reached our tents, I helped him change into dry clothes and get back into his sleeping bag. He fell asleep immediately, breathing deep and even, but his skin remained cold to the touch. I sat outside his tent for the rest of the night, listening and watching. Just before dawn, I heard the chanting again, but this time it seemed to be coming from David's tent. Low, rhythmic sounds that were almost words, but not quite. When I looked inside, he appeared to be asleep, but his lips were moving in time with the chanting. The fourth day, David seemed normal again, tired and confused about the night before, but himself. He claimed he remembered nothing after going to sleep. "I don't sleepwalk," he insisted as we packed up. "Never have." "Well, you did last night. You scared the hell out of me." But as we hiked that day, I noticed changes in him. Small things at first. He'd pause mid-sentence and stare off into the distance, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He'd laugh at things that weren't funny, or sometimes laugh at nothing at all. When I asked him direct questions, there was often a delay before he answered, as if he had to remember how to speak. Most disturbing was the way he looked at me. There were moments when his gaze would linger too long, studying my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was like being examined by something that was trying to figure out how to be human. We were hiking through a particularly twisted section of canyon when our conversation turned to my brother Jake. I'd been talking about the climbing accident, how I blamed myself for not being there, when David suddenly stopped walking. "Your brother," he said, his voice taking on that flat quality again. "Jake. He fell from the north face of Mount Washington, didn't he?" I stared at him. "No, David. He fell from Cannon Cliff in New Hampshire. Mount Washington is where we scattered his ashes. I never told you about Mount Washington." David blinked slowly, then smiled, but it was wrong, too wide, showing too many teeth. "Of course, Cannon Cliff. I misspoke." But I knew he hadn't misspoken. He'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had, and the way he'd said Jake's name, with a kind of hungry familiarity, made my stomach turn. That night, I pretended to sleep while keeping watch on David's tent. Around midnight, I saw his silhouette sit up in his sleeping bag. He remained perfectly still for nearly an hour, then slowly unzipped his tent and stepped outside. In the starlight, I watched him walk to the edge of our camp and begin that low, rhythmic chanting I'd been hearing. But now I could see his lips moving, see his body swaying slightly as he faced the canyon walls. The sound seemed to call up answering echoes from the rocks, as if the stone itself was responding. After 20 minutes, he stopped chanting and stood motionless for another hour. Then he returned to his tent as silently as he'd left. In the morning, when I asked him about it, he looked at me with genuine confusion. "Chanting? Mike, I slept through the night. You must have been dreaming." But I knew what I'd seen. Whatever was happening to David was getting worse, and we were still 3 days from the nearest road. Day 5 brought us to the most remote part of our route, high in the jerky mountains where the trees thinned out and the rock took on strange, twisted formations. The landscape here felt actively malevolent, as if the earth itself harbored some ancient grudge against human presence. David had been quiet all morning, answering my attempts at conversation with grunts or single-word responses. When he did speak, his voice had that flat, a motionless quality that made me think of recordings played at the wrong speed. We were setting up camp near a natural spring when I noticed the bones. They were scattered around the water source, bleached white fragments that could have been from deer or elk, but some of them looked disturbingly human. Ribs that were too long, a skull with too many holes, finger bones arranged in patterns that reminded me of the silverware from our first night. "David, look at this," I called, but when I turned around, he was gone. His pack was still there, half unpacked, but David had vanished as completely as if the earth had swallowed him. I called his name, hearing my voice echo off the peaks, but got no response. I spent 2 hours searching, following every possible route he could have taken. Finally, as the sun was setting, I found him sitting on a ledge about 200 feet up the canyon wall. He was facing away from me, perfectly still, and when I called up to him, he didn't respond. It took me 40 minutes to climb up to where he sat. The ledge was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and the drop was nearly vertical. One wrong move would mean certain death. "David, what are you doing up here? How did you even get up here?" He turned toward me and I had to grab the rock face to keep from falling. His eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible eye, as if someone had filled them with ink. When he smiled, his teeth looked different too. Sharper, more pointed, wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. "Beautiful view from up here," he said in that flat voice. "You can see everything. All the places people have died. David, you're scaring me. We need to get down from here." He laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "David's not here right now, but don't worry, he's safe. We're taking good care of him." "We?" "The old ones. The ones who were here before your people, before the cliff builders, before anyone. We've been waiting so long for visitors." I was pressing myself against the rock wall, trying to process what I was hearing. This wasn't David anymore, or if it was, something had taken hold of him that was beyond my understanding. "What do you want?" I whispered. "To go home," the thing wearing David's face said. "We've been trapped here so long, in the spaces between the rocks, in the empty places your maps can't show. But with flesh to wear, we can walk in the world again." "Let him go." It tilted David's head at an unnatural angle, studying me. "Why would we do that? He invited us in. All that pain, all that guilt about his failed marriage. It made him hollow, hungry, perfect for us to fill." I thought about David's behavior over the past few days, the personality changes, the knowledge he shouldn't have had. "How long?" "Since the first night. We've been studying him, learning to wear him properly. Soon, we'll be ready to return to the world of roads and cities and electric lights. Think of all the hollow people we'll find there, all the ones made empty by loss and failure and grief." The thing looked at me with David's eyes, now returned to normal but somehow still wrong. "Like you, Michael Williams. You blame yourself for your brother's death, don't you? You think if you'd been there you could have saved him. All that guilt, eating you hollow from the inside. You'd make a fine vessel, too." I backed away along the ledge, but there was nowhere to go. Below me was a 200-foot drop. Above me, vertical rock. And David, or the thing wearing his body, was between me and the only way down. "I won't let you use him," I said, though I had no idea how I could stop it. "You don't have a choice, but we're grateful for your friendship. When we wear David's flesh in the outside world, we'll remember you. We'll tell people about brave Michael Williams, who followed his friend into the wilderness and never came back." That's when I noticed the climbing gear on my belt, the same gear I'd worn when Jake and I used to climb together, the gear I'd brought on this trip for reasons I couldn't explain. My hand found the handle of my ice axe, its weight familiar and comforting. "You made a mistake," I said. "What mistake?" "You chose the wrong hollow man." I lunged forward, swinging the ice axe at David's head. The thing wearing his body moved impossibly fast, but on the narrow ledge there wasn't much room to maneuver. The pick of the axe caught it in the shoulder, and it screamed. Not with David's voice, but with something else. Something that made the rock face vibrate and sent loose stones raining down from above. black blood poured from the wound, more than any human body could contain. The thing staggered, lost its footing, and I watched David's body tumble off the ledge, striking the rocks below with a sound I'll never forget. I climbed down as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the holds. When I reached the bottom, I found David's body broken on the stones, his neck bent at an impossible angle. But his eyes were clear again, fully human, and when he saw me, he managed a weak smile. "Mike," he whispered, blood frothing at his lips. "It's me again. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop it. Don't talk. I'll get help." But we both knew there was no help to get. We were 3 days from the nearest road and David was dying. I held his hand as his breathing grew shallow, and in his final moments he squeezed my fingers and said, "Thank you for bringing me back." I buried David as best I could with the tools I had, marking the grave with a cairn of stones. Then I gathered both our packs and started the long hike out alone. It took me 4 days to reach the trailhead, 4 days of hiking through landscapes that had returned to normal, where my GPS worked and my map showed the correct features. But even now, 6 months later, I sometimes catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there. Shadows that move wrong, voices in empty rooms, faces in crowds that look like David but with eyes that are just a little too dark. The thing that wore my friend's body told the truth about one thing. There are a lot of hollow people in the world, people made empty by loss and failure and grief. I've learned to fill my own emptiness with purpose instead of letting it fester. I volunteer with Search and Rescue now, helping find lost hikers in the wilderness. I tell people to stay on marked trails, to never travel alone, to respect the old places that were wild before humans ever walked upright. Because some places remember when the world was different, when other things moved between the trees and slept in the spaces between stones. And sometimes, if you're hollow enough, if you're empty enough from loss and pain, those old things might decide you'd make a fine vessel for walking in the world again. David's funeral was closed casket. I told his ex-wife he'd fallen while climbing, which was true enough. I never mentioned what I saw in his eyes those last few days, or the way he'd moved like a puppet with tangled strings. Some truths are too heavy for the living to carry. But I think about him often when I'm in the wilderness, especially in the quiet places where the silence presses down like water and the shadows seem to watch you pass. I think about the choices we make when grief and guilt hollow us out, and what might be waiting to fill the empty spaces we leave behind. The Gila wilderness is still there, vast and beautiful and dangerous in ways the maps can't show. 588,014 acres of ancient stone and hidden springs, of cliff dwellings built by people who knew when to leave, of places where old things sleep and dream and wait for visitors hollow enough to make suitable homes. I'll never go back there. But sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and the silence grows too deep, I can hear David's voice calling my name from somewhere far away, asking me to come find him in the darkness between the stones. And sometimes, God help me, I'm tempted to answer. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the remote wilderness near the Gila National Forest in southwestern New Mexico, about 40 miles from the tiny settlement of Reserve. What was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with my coworkers turned into something that still makes me wake up screaming 3 months later. It started innocently enough. 5 of us from the accounting firm had decided we needed to get away from the fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets. David Chen, my cubicle neighbor and the one who'd organized the whole thing, had been talking about this perfect spot his cousin had told him about, a hidden canyon with a natural spring, completely off the beaten path. "Trust me," he'd said with that easy grin of his, "it'll be like having our own private wilderness resort." The others were excited. Sarah Martinez, our department's rising star who worked harder than anyone else I knew, had been talking about needing to disconnect and recharge. Tom Bradford, the office comedian whose jokes got progressively worse under stress, was already planning campfire stories. And Jennifer Lopez, Not the celebrity, as she constantly had to clarify, was our nature enthusiast who knew which plants were edible and how to read weather patterns. I should have paid attention to the warning signs from the moment we left the main highway. David's GPS had started glitching, showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, then switching to a town in Colorado that didn't exist. "Must be the mountains interfering with the signal," he'd laughed, pulling out a paper map that looked like it had been printed in the 1980s. The dirt road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into terrain that grew increasingly desolate. Ancient juniper trees twisted from red sandstone, their branches reaching like arthritic fingers against a sky that was too pale, too empty. The landscape felt wrong somehow, not just remote but forgotten, as if the world had deliberately turned away from this place. "Are we sure this is right?" Sarah asked, checking her phone for the 10th time. "I lost cell service about 20 miles back." "It's supposed to be remote," David replied, but I caught the slight uncertainty in his voice. He kept glancing at the map, rotating it as if a different angle might make the roads line up better. When we finally reached what David claimed was our destination, the sun was already touching the western horizon. The canyon was there, exactly as described. A narrow cleft in the earth with steep walls rising about 60 feet on either side. A thin stream trickled through the bottom, creating a small pool near what looked like a natural amphitheater of stone. It was beautiful, I had to admit, but something about it felt deeply wrong. "This is it?" Tom asked, looking around dubiously. "It's kind of claustrophobic." He wasn't wrong. The canyon walls seemed to lean inward, creating a sense of enclosure that made my chest tight. Shadows pooled in the corners where the rock formations created overhangs, and those shadows seemed darker than they should be, even with the approaching evening. "Come on, guys," David said, already pulling gear from his SUV. "Look at this place. When's the last time any of us saw stars without light pollution? And that water looks crystal clear." Jennifer was examining the ground near the stream. "The soil composition is interesting," she said, crouching down to sift sand through her fingers. "Almost ashy. Must be volcanic." As we set up camp, I noticed more things that bothered me. The silence was too complete. No bird calls, no insect sounds, nothing but the faint whisper of water over stone. The air had a strange taste to it, metallic and old, like pennies left in the rain, and the walls of the canyon seemed to absorb sound in an unnatural way. When Tom called out to test the echo, his voice came back distorted, as if filtered through mud. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is?" Sarah asked as she struggled with her tent. The fabric kept billowing in ways that suggested wind, but I couldn't feel any breeze. "That's the point," David said, but he was looking around now too, his earlier enthusiasm dimmed. "Total isolation. No traffic, no city noise, no—" A sound echoed from somewhere up the canyon walls, a scraping noise like fingernails on stone. We all froze. "Probably just rock shifting," Jennifer said, but her voice was small. "Temperature changes can cause expansion and contraction in the stone." The first night passed without major incident, though none of us slept well. I kept hearing sounds that might have been wind or might have been breathing. Around 3 a.m., I could have sworn I heard footsteps circling our camp, but when I unzipped my tent to look, there was nothing but darkness so thick it seemed solid. Tom later admitted he'd heard it too. "Like someone walking barefoot on stone," he whispered, "just walking in circles around us for hours." Morning brought little relief. The sunlight that filtered down between the canyon walls was thin and gray, creating a perpetual twilight atmosphere even at midday. Worse, our gear had been disturbed. Small things. Sarah's water bottle moved from beside her tent to the opposite side of camp, Tom's hiking boots placed neatly together when he was certain he'd left them scattered, Jennifer's field guide to southwestern Flora opened to a page about poisonous plants she swore she'd never bookmarked. "Maybe we're just tired," David suggested, but he was checking his backpack obsessively, as if making sure everything was still there. First night camping can be disorienting. It was Jennifer who first noticed the tracks. She'd gone to refill our water bottles at the spring and came back with her face pale, holding out her phone with the camera app open. "These were around the water source," she said, showing us the image. "The tracks were human-shaped but wrong. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips, and they seemed to have been pressed into the stone itself as if the rock had been soft when they were made." "Could be indigenous art," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Petroglyphs or something. This area has a lot of Native American history." Tom was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photo. "Those aren't petroglyphs," he said finally. "Petroglyphs are carved or painted. These look fresh." That afternoon, while we were exploring the upper reaches of the canyon, David's behavior started to change. He'd always been the energetic one, the organizer, but now he seemed distracted, often stopping to stare at empty patches of air or tilting his head as if listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. "David," Sarah called when he'd been standing motionless for several minutes, looking up at a section of canyon wall that appeared identical to every other section. "You okay?" He turned to us with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just admiring the geology," he said. But I noticed he kept touching his temples as if he had a headache. That evening, as we gathered around our campfire, David announced he was going to collect more firewood from further up the canyon. The wood we'd brought wasn't burning properly. The flames kept shifting from orange to an unsettling blue-green color, and the smoke smelled wrong, like burning hair. "I'll come with you," I offered, but David shook his head. "Nah, I need to stretch my legs. Clear my head. I'll be back in 20 minutes. He'd been gone for over an hour when we started to worry. The canyon was treacherous in the dark, with loose rocks and hidden crevices that could easily twist an ankle or worse. Tom wanted to organize a search party, but Jennifer pointed out that we could easily get lost ourselves in the maze of side passages and rock formations. "He's got his flashlight," Sarah said, but she was checking her phone again, as if cell service might have magically returned. "He's probably just lost track of time." When David finally returned, something was wrong. He emerged from the darkness at the edge of our firelight carrying an armload of wood, but he moved differently. Too smooth, too quiet, like he was floating just above the ground. His face looked the same, but there was something off about his expression, a blankness behind his eyes that made my skin crawl. "Sorry," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Took longer than expected." "David?" Sarah stood up, frowning. "Are you feeling okay? You look—" "I'm fine." He arranged the wood he'd brought with mechanical precision, each piece placed exactly parallel to the others. "Just tired." But he wasn't tired. He sat by the fire without blinking, staring into the flames with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. When Tom tried to resume the conversation we'd been having about work, David didn't respond. When Jennifer asked him about the types of wood he'd found, he turned to look at her with that same blank expression. "Wood," he said, as if that explained everything. I found myself studying his face in the firelight, trying to figure out what was bothering me. Everything was there. The same features, the same clothes, even a small scar on his chin from a childhood accident he'd told us about. But it was like looking at a perfect photograph of David rather than David himself. That night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard movement outside my tent, the soft whisper of fabric, footsteps on sand. I assumed someone was going to the bathroom, but the sounds continued for too long, moving in slow circles around our campsite. I unzipped my tent flap just enough to peer out. David was standing in the center of our camp, perfectly still, his back to me. He was wearing the same clothes he'd gone to bed in, but his feet were bare. As I watched, he began to walk, or rather glide, toward the canyon walls, moving with that same unnatural smoothness I'd noticed earlier. I should have called out, should have woken the others, but something primitive in my brain was screaming at me to stay hidden. This thing that looked like David didn't feel human anymore. He stopped at the base of the cliff face and began to climb. Not with ropes or gear, but simply placing his hands and feet against the stone and ascending as easily as walking upstairs. Within moments, he'd disappeared into the darkness above, and I was left staring at empty rock, wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing. But in the morning, there were more of those impossible footprints pressed into the stone around our camp, and David's hiking boots were sitting outside his tent, caked with a red clay that didn't exist anywhere in the canyon. "Everyone sleep okay?" David asked cheerfully as he emerged from his tent, acting completely normal except for that persistent blankness in his eyes. The others seemed oblivious to the change in him, chatting about breakfast plans and whether we should hike to the upper pools Jennifer had spotted on her geology survey. But I found myself watching David constantly, noting how he moved too precisely, how he never seemed to blink, how his shadow seemed to fall at the wrong angle no matter where the sun was positioned. It was Tom who made the discovery that changed everything. He'd gone to take some photos of the canyon formations and came back running, his face white with terror. "There's something up there," he gasped, pointing toward the upper reaches of the canyon. "In one of the alcoves. I think it's a body." We climbed up to investigate, David moving with that same eerily perfect grace while the rest of us struggled with the loose rock and steep angles. The alcove Tom had found was about 30 feet up the south wall, a natural pocket in the stone that was invisible from ground level. Inside, we found what was left of David Chen. The body was positioned sitting up, back against the stone wall, arms resting naturally at its sides. It was mummified by the dry climate, skin stretched tight over bones, but it was unmistakably David. Same face, same clothes, even the same watch he'd been wearing. But this David had been dead for weeks, maybe months. "That's impossible," Sarah whispered, backing away from the alcove. "David's right here. He's been with us the whole time." We turned to look at the thing that had been traveling with us, the thing that wore David's face. It stood motionless, watching us with those blank, unblinking eyes, and slowly, impossibly, began to smile. The smile kept growing, stretching wider than any human mouth should be able to stretch, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. When it spoke, the voice was still David's, but layered with something else, something that sounded like wind through bone. "You shouldn't have looked," it said. Jennifer screamed. Tom stumbled backward and nearly fell off the narrow ledge. Sarah was hyperventilating, making small whimpering sounds. But I couldn't look away from that terrible expanding smile. The thing that wasn't David began to change. Its limbs stretched and twisted, joints bending in directions that violated anatomy. Its skin took on a grayish pallor, and dark veins became visible beneath the surface like a network of poisoned rivers. The familiar features melted and reformed, becoming something that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. "Skinwalker," Jennifer breathed, the word barely audible. It laughed, a sound like grinding glass. "Your friend was easy," it said, gesturing toward the mummified corpse with one elongated arm. "Wandering alone in the dark, so far from help. He lasted 3 days before I wore him down enough to take his shape. And you welcomed me into your camp, shared your fire, trusted me completely." The transformation accelerated. What had once looked like David was now clearly something else. Tall and emaciated, with skin like old leather and fingers that ended in curved talons. Its eyes had become completely black, reflecting our terror like dark mirrors. "The old stories say we can only take the shape of something we've killed," it continued, circling us with predatory grace. "But they don't mention how much we enjoy the deception. How sweet it is to watch you interact with your friend's murderer, never suspecting, never knowing." Tom made a break for it first, scrambling down the rocky slope toward camp. The skinwalker let him get halfway before moving, covering the distance in a single fluid leap that defied physics. There was a sound like breaking branches, and Tom's scream cut off abruptly. "Run!" I shouted to the others, but Jennifer was frozen in place, staring at the thing that had worn David's face. Sarah was already moving, slipping and sliding down the treacherous slope, and I grabbed Jennifer's arm to pull her after me. Behind us, the skinwalker was making sounds, wet, tearing sounds accompanied by Tom's voice pleading for help. But Tom was already dead. I'd heard his neck snap. Whatever was speaking with his voice wasn't him anymore. We reached the bottom of the canyon and ran for the vehicles, but the Skinwalker had been busy during its time with us. All 4 cars had been systematically destroyed, tires slashed, engines filled with sand, battery cables cut. The thing had been planning this from the moment it replaced David. "The radio," Sarah gasped, pointing to Tom's emergency radio, in his pack. We found the radio, but when Sarah tried to call for help, the only response was static. Then, cutting through the white noise, we heard Tom's voice. "Help us. Please help us. We're trapped in the canyon with something that isn't human. It killed David. It killed—" The transmission cut to screams, and we realized the Skinwalker was using our friend's dying moments to torment us. "The hike out," Jennifer said, her voice steady despite her obvious terror. "It's 40 miles to the highway, but if we leave now, travel light." The Skinwalker's laughter echoed from the canyon walls, seeming to come from every direction at once. 40 miles through my territory, in the dark, with no food, no water, no supplies. You'll die of exposure before you reach the road. If I let you." I was gathering what little we could carry, water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Our footprints from the past 2 days were still visible in the sandy areas around camp, but there was something wrong with them. David's prints, the ones from the real David, stopped abruptly at the place where he'd gone to collect firewood. But, leading away from that spot, there were those other tracks, the impossibly long ones with claw marks that had been pressed into solid stone. The Skinwalker had been leaving them the entire time, marking its territory, and we'd been too afraid to understand what we were seeing. As night fell, we started our desperate hike out of the canyon. The Skinwalker followed us, sometimes visible as a dark shape against the stars, sometimes invisible but audibly present. Footsteps on stone, the whisper of claws against rock, the sound of our dead friends' voices calling our names from the darkness. It was playing with us. Every time we thought we'd gained some distance, it would appear ahead of us on the trail, forcing us to backtrack or find alternate routes through terrain that became increasingly treacherous in the dark. My flashlight began to dim after the first hour, and Sarah's died completely. "It's hurting us," Jennifer realized as we found ourselves facing yet another dead end, driving us away from the road. She was right. Every path the Skinwalker allowed us to take led deeper into the wilderness, further from any hope of rescue. We were being guided towards something, but I didn't want to think about what that might be. Around midnight, exhausted and disoriented, we found ourselves in another narrow canyon that looked exactly like the one we'd been trying to escape. The same red sandstone walls, the same impossible silence, even the same thin stream trickling through the center. "That's not possible," Sarah said, checking the stars. "We've been walking north. We should be miles away." But there was our campsite, exactly as we'd left it. Our tents, the cold remains of our fire, Tom's scattered gear. Even the mummified corpse of the real David was visible in its alcove above us. The Skinwalker was waiting by the dead fire, wearing Tom's face now, his features arranged in an expression of mock sympathy. "Poor things," it said in Tom's voice. "So tired, so lost. Why don't you rest? You're safe here." I realized then that we'd never left the canyon at all. The Skinwalker had used some kind of supernatural influence to make us think we were hiking out while we were actually walking in circles. The landscape itself was wrong here. Geometry that bent back on itself like a Mobius strip. "What do you want?" I demanded, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. The thing wearing Tom's face tilted its head. "Want? I want to understand you. Your memories, your fears, your loves and losses. I want to wear your lives like clothing." It gestured to the canyon walls, and I saw them. Dozens of alcoves carved into the stone, each containing the desiccated remains of hikers and campers who had been lured here over the years. Men, women, children, all positioned like some grotesque museum display. Each one taught me something new, the Skinwalker said. How to laugh, how to cry, how to make you trust me. The child in Alcove 7 taught me innocent wonder. The woman in Alcove 12 showed me maternal love. Your friend David, he taught me about loyalty. Sarah was backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose on all sides, trapping us with this thing that collected human lives like trophies. You won't understand, it continued, because you've never been truly alone. I was the first and only one, created when the world was young and humans were just beginning to tell stories around fires. I learned to mimic you by watching, by listening, by taking pieces of the dying. But mimicry isn't understanding. I need to live your experiences, feel your emotions, remember your memories. Jennifer spoke up suddenly, her voice shaking but determined. The old stories say you can only take the shape of something you've killed. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if you need something more? The Skinwalker's borrowed features shifted, showing genuine curiosity. Continue. Consent, she said. Not just death, but willing surrender. That's why you keep us alive, why you play these games. You're trying to break us down until we give up, until we choose death. The thing's smile faltered slightly. Clever girl. Yes, unwilling victims provide only surface details, appearance, mannerisms, basic memories. But those who surrender completely, who choose to let me in rather than endure more suffering, they give me everything. Their entire sense of self becomes mine. And that's why you can't leave this place, I realized. You're bound here until you find someone willing to trade places with you. For the first time, the Skinwalker looked genuinely angry. Its borrowed features twisted into something inhuman, and when it spoke, the voice was layered with centuries of rage and frustration. 87 years I've been trapped in this canyon, collecting pieces of lives but never gaining the freedom to leave. 87 years of tourists and hikers who choose death rather than surrender. But you're different. Stronger. More afraid. The fear will wear you down. Eventually. It was then that I noticed something else about our situation. The Skinwalker was keeping us all alive, but it was focusing most of its attention on me. The way it watched me. The way it spoke. It had chosen me as its primary target. Michael, Sarah whispered, and I realized she'd noticed it too. The creature smiled with Tom's face. Your friends are just entertainment, ways to motivate you. But you have something special, a deep, primal terror that will season your surrender beautifully. It was right. I was terrified in ways I'd never imagined possible. The claustrophobic canyon walls, the darkness that seemed to have weight and substance, the knowledge that my friends were dead and this thing was wearing their faces, all of it was crushing down on me like a physical force. But terror, I realized, could also be clarifying. I started gathering stones from around the dead campfire, filling my pockets with the largest ones I could find. Sarah and Jennifer watched in confusion, but I was remembering something Jennifer had said earlier about the soil composition. Volcanic ash, I said quietly. The canyon floor is covered in volcanic ash. Jennifer's eyes widened with understanding. Iron content. High iron content in volcanic soil. The Skinwalker was still monologuing about the sweetness of willing surrender, unaware that we were having our own conversation. In the old stories, certain things could harm supernatural entities. Salt, iron, silver. If the ash contained enough iron. I filled my water bottle with the ashy soil, making sure to get the darkest, finest particles. Then I started moving toward the creature, trying to look defeated and broken. You're right, I said, my voice hollow. I can't take any more. The fear, the hopelessness. I'll do whatever you want if you just make it stop. The Skinwalker's smile widened, and for a moment its true form flickered through, ancient, emaciated, hungry beyond measure. Say the words, it whispered. Say you surrender willingly. I took another step closer, raising the water bottle. I surrender. And threw the iron-rich ash directly into its face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The skinwalker shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and its stolen human features began to melt away. Where the ash touched its skin, angry red burns appeared, spreading like acid through its supernatural flesh. "Run!" I shouted to the others, but we were already moving. The creature's agonized screams echoed from the canyon walls as it clawed at its burning face, temporarily blinded and disoriented. We climbed. There was no path, no plan except to get as far from the skinwalker as possible while it was incapacitated. The canyon walls were treacherous in the dark, but terror gave us strength and coordination we shouldn't have possessed. Behind us, the screaming stopped. That was somehow worse than the noise, the sudden, complete silence that meant the creature was hunting again. We reached a narrow ledge about 40 feet up the south wall when we heard it coming. Not footsteps this time, but a scratching, skittering sound like an enormous spider climbing stone. The skinwalker had abandoned any pretense of human shape and was pursuing us in its true form. "There!" Jennifer pointed to a crevice in the rock face, barely wide enough for a human body. "If we can reach it." The gap led to what looked like a natural tunnel system, possibly connecting to the surface. It was our only chance, but it meant traversing about 20 feet of exposed cliff face with handholds that were marginal at best. Sarah went first, her small frame making her the most agile climber among us. She reached the crevice and squeezed inside, calling back that there was indeed a passage. Jennifer followed, moving with careful determination. I was halfway across when the skinwalker reached our ledge. In its true form, it was even more horrible. A skeletal thing with too many joints and appendages that shifted between arms and legs depending on the angle of the rock face. Its head was an elongated skull with hollow eye sockets that seemed to contain swirling darkness. It moved across the cliff face like a liquid shadow, defying gravity and anatomy. One of its extended limbs swiped at my legs, talons scraping stone where my feet had been a second before. I lunged for the crevice, felt Sarah and Jennifer grab my arms and pull me through just as another set of claws raked the air where my back had been. The tunnel was narrow, barely allowing us to crawl single file, but it led upward through the rock. Behind us, we could hear the skinwalker trying to follow, but its transformed shape was too large for the passage. Its frustrated howls echoed through the stone as we climbed. The tunnel system was more extensive than we'd hoped, with multiple branching passages that led through the heart of the mesa. Some were natural formations, but others showed signs of deliberate construction, carved channels that might have been made by whatever people had lived here before the canyon became cursed. We followed every upward passage we could find, and after what felt like hours of crawling through claustrophobic darkness, we finally saw a faint glow ahead, starlight, filtering down through a crack in the surface rock. The opening was barely large enough for us to squeeze through, but it led to the mesa top, about a quarter-mile from where we'd originally descended into the canyon. The night air felt like freedom after the oppressive atmosphere below, but we weren't safe yet. The skinwalker might be trapped by the iron ash and the narrow tunnel system, but we were still 40 miles from civilization with no food, no supplies, and no transportation. We oriented ourselves by the stars and started walking toward what we hoped was the highway. The terrain was rough, broken stone, hidden arroyos, patches of sand that grabbed at our feet, but it was better than being trapped with that thing. Dawn found us exhausted and dehydrated, but still moving. The landscape had changed from red sandstone to more typical high desert, which suggested we were traveling in the right direction. In the distance, we could see what looked like a road. It took most of the morning to reach it, but it was indeed a highway. Not the main road we'd taken into the wilderness, but a smaller state route that showed signs of regular use. The first vehicle that came along was a pickup truck driven by a rancher who took one look at our condition and radioed for help without asking questions. The authorities found our destroyed vehicles exactly where we'd left them, but they never found Tom's body or the mummified remains in the canyon alcoves. When they returned with a full search team the next day, the canyon itself seemed to have changed. Passages that we remembered were gone. replaced by solid rock, and the natural amphitheater where we'd camped had been filled with rubble as if by a landslide. The official report blamed our experience on dehydration, exposure, and group hysteria. Tom was listed as missing, presumed dead in a hiking accident. David's death was attributed to a fall, though they couldn't explain how his body had ended up in an alcove that supposedly didn't exist. I've never told anyone the real story until now. Sarah moved to another state and refuses to discuss what happened. Jennifer transferred to a different department and avoids me in the halls. We all deal with the trauma in our own ways, but the nightmares never completely stop. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up convinced that I can hear Tom's voice calling for help, or David's laughter from the darkness outside my window. The rational part of my mind knows it's just psychological after-effects of extreme trauma. But there's another part, the part that remembers those black, hollow eyes, that wonders if the Skinwalker's influence extends beyond the boundaries of that cursed canyon. 3 months later, and I still check locks obsessively. I avoid camping, hiking, or any activity that takes me too far from populated areas. The sight of red sandstone formation sends me into panic attacks, and sometimes when I'm walking alone at night, I have the unsettling feeling that my shadow falls at the wrong angle, or that my reflection doesn't quite match my movements. Because the thing about skinwalkers, according to the stories Jennifer researched afterward, is that they're infectious. Not in a biological sense, but in a spiritual one. Prolonged contact with one can leave marks, changes, tiny tears in the boundary between human and other that might never fully heal. I tell myself this is just paranoia, just trauma-induced anxiety that will fade with time and therapy. But last week, I caught myself walking too quietly, moving with a smoothness that didn't feel natural. And when I looked in the bathroom mirror, for just a split second, I could have sworn my eyes reflected the light like dark pools instead of normal human eyes. The Skinwalker wanted willing surrender, wanted someone to choose to trade places with it. We denied it that satisfaction, hurt it, possibly even damaged it permanently with the iron ash. But escape isn't the same as victory, and some wounds go deeper than flesh. I'm scheduled for another session with the therapist next week. Dr. Martinez thinks I'm making progress, that the nightmares are becoming less frequent and the intrusive thoughts less powerful. She's probably right. Trauma does heal, given time and proper treatment. But tonight, as I write this, I keep noticing small things that don't feel quite right. The way my handwriting looks slightly different than usual. The fact that I haven't blinked in the past several minutes. The growing certainty that someone, or something, has been watching me through the window, even though I live on the 4th floor. And the strangest thing of all, I can't remember the last time I felt truly hungry, or tired, or even completely human. Maybe Dr. Martinez is right. Maybe this is just a long, slow process of psychological recovery. Maybe the feeling that something fundamental has changed inside me is just a normal part of healing from supernatural trauma. Or maybe the Skinwalker got what it wanted after all, just not in the way any of us expected. I guess I'll find out tomorrow when I look in the mirror and see whose face is looking back. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico, 47 miles northeast of Silver City, in October of last year. I should have listened to my gut when the Navajo gas station attendant in reserve looked at our camping permits and shook his head. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he handed back our paperwork, and he muttered something in his native language that made the hair on my arms stand up. But I was trying to be the responsible trip coordinator for our work group, and backing out would have meant disappointing 4 colleagues who'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. Our accounting firm had been through a brutal busy season, and this camping trip to the Mogollon Mountains was supposed to be our reward. Jennifer Davis, our most outdoorsy team member, had suggested the location after finding it in some obscure hiking forum. She was 29, athletic, and had an infectious enthusiasm for wilderness adventures that had convinced the rest of us to agree to something we'd normally never consider. Robert Johnson, our 35-year-old senior accountant, had been skeptical from the start. He was the type who triple-checked everything and preferred his nature experiences to come with nearby hotels and room service. Sarah Rodriguez, 31 and quietly observant, had surprised us all by agreeing to come. She rarely spoke up in meetings, but something about this trip had sparked her interest. David Jones, our 28-year-old junior associate and office comedian, had immediately signed up, joking that he needed to reconnect with his primal side after months of spreadsheets. The 5 of us had driven up from Albuquerque in 2 vehicles, Jennifer and I in my SUV, the others following in Robert's sedan. The drive had taken us through increasingly desolate terrain, past weathered mesas and stands of ponderosa pine that seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. By the time we reached our planned camping spot near Middle Fork Creek, the sun was already sinking toward the jagged horizon. The first sign something was wrong came as we were setting up camp. I was helping Sarah with her tent when my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You shouldn't have come here." The message vanished from my screen before I could screenshot it, leaving me staring at an empty conversation thread. When I tried to show it to the others, they looked at me like I was losing my mind. "Probably just some punk kids messing with cell towers," Robert said, though he kept glancing over his shoulder as he unpacked his gear. Remote areas get weird signal bounce sometimes. But it wasn't just the message. As darkness fell with the unnatural speed it does in mountain country, I became increasingly aware that we were being watched. Not the casual observation of forest animals, but something deliberate and malevolent. Every time I looked toward the tree line, I caught glimpses of movement that stopped the moment my eyes focused on it. Jennifer had insisted on building our fire in a clearing she'd scouted earlier, about 50 yards from our tent cluster. The flames danced normally at first, casting familiar orange light across our faces as we shared trail mix and whiskey from David's flask. But as the night deepened, the fire began behaving strangely. The flames would suddenly flicker blue-green for no apparent reason, or lean away from the wind instead of with it. When I mentioned it, David laughed and made a joke about altitude affecting our perceptions. "Maybe we're all getting a contact high from some mountain fungi," he said, but his usual grin seemed forced in the weird light. Around 11 p.m., Sarah pointed toward the darkness beyond our fire circle. "Do you hear that?" We all fell silent, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing but the usual forest symphony of wind and settling wood. Then, carried on the night air, came a sound that made my blood freeze, a perfect mimicry of David's distinctive laugh, echoing from somewhere deep in the trees. David's face went pale. "That wasn't me." The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like Jennifer calling my name from the direction of the creek. But Jennifer was sitting right next to me, her hand gripping my arm so tightly her nails drew blood through my jacket. "We should go back to the vehicles," Robert said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. But when we turned toward where we'd parked, the cars were gone. The dirt road that had brought us here stretched empty in both directions, as if the vehicles had never existed. Jennifer pulled out her GPS device, then her phone, then a backup compass. None of them worked. The GPS showed our location as a blank gray void, the phone displayed no service despite having full bars earlier, and the compass needle spun lazily without settling on any direction. "Equipment malfunction," Robert insisted, but his voice cracked on the words. "Electromagnetic interference from the mountains." That's when David volunteered to gather more firewood from the forest edge. Looking back, I realized that was the moment everything went irreversibly wrong. At the time, it seemed like typical David behavior, turning nervous energy into action, making jokes to lighten the mood. He grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the tree line, calling over his shoulder, "Back in 5 minutes with enough wood to keep us toasty till dawn." Those were the last normal words any of us heard him speak. He was gone for exactly 17 minutes. I know because Robert was obsessively checking his watch, growing more agitated with each passing minute. When David finally emerged from the darkness, carrying an armload of perfectly stacked kindling, something fundamental had changed. The first thing I noticed was his gait. David had always walked with a slight bounce in his step, an energetic swagger that matched his personality. Now he moved with fluid, predatory grace, each footfall silent despite the dry leaves carpeting the forest floor. His clothing was immaculate. No dirt, no pine needles, no sign he'd been crawling around in the underbrush gathering wood. "Got enough to last us," he said, his voice identical to how it had always sounded, yet somehow completely wrong. The cadence was off, the emphasis falling on strange syllables, as if someone was reading a script without understanding the meaning. Jennifer noticed it too. She kept staring at David with growing unease as he methodically fed sticks to the fire. "David, are you feeling okay?" she asked. "You seem different." David turned toward her, and in the firelight I saw that his pupils had dilated to completely black circles, reflecting the flames like polished obsidian. When he smiled, his teeth seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Never felt better," he said, and the way he drew out the words made my skin crawl. The wrongness wasn't just in how he looked or moved. David had forgotten things. When Sarah mentioned our company's annual Christmas party, an event David had helped organize and talked about constantly, he stared at her blankly. When Robert referenced an inside joke about a client's ridiculous demands, David tilted his head like a confused animal. But the most unsettling change was how he watched us. The old David had been gregarious, always making eye contact during conversations, including everyone in his jokes and stories. This David tracked our movements with predatory focus, his gaze lingering on our throats, studying the pulse points at our wrists. When he thought no one was looking, I caught him sniffing the air like he was sampling our scent. Sarah was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "That's not David," she whispered when he stepped away to relieve himself in the trees. "Something happened to him out there." Robert's analytical mind was struggling to process what he was witnessing. People don't just change. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe he hit his head, suffered a concussion that's affecting his behavior. But even as he spoke, Robert was backing away from the fire, putting distance between himself and the thing wearing David's face. We all were. Some primal part of our brains recognized a predator when we saw one, regardless of its familiar appearance. When David returned from the trees, he positioned himself between us and the path leading back toward where our vehicles should have been. It might have been coincidence, but the tactical positioning felt deliberate, calculated. He began telling stories, but they were wrong. Details from our shared experiences twisted and corrupted, as if he'd learned about our lives secondhand from an unreliable source. "Remember that time we all went to that Mexican restaurant for Jennifer's birthday?" he said, still wearing that too wide smile. "The one where Sarah got food poisoning and spent the night throwing up blood?" Jennifer's birthday had been at an Italian place, and Sarah had been fine. But when we tried to correct him, David just laughed, that same hollow mimicry we'd heard earlier from the forest. The temperature was dropping fast, our breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air, but none of us wanted to retreat to our tents. Being alone with whatever David had become seemed infinitely more terrifying than enduring the cold. We huddled closer to the fire, which continued its disturbing color changes, sometimes burning so hot it singed our eyebrows, other times barely smoldering despite having plenty of fuel. Around 2 a.m., exhaustion was taking its toll. Sarah's eyelids were drooping, and Robert was swaying on his feet. Even Jennifer, with all her outdoor experience, was struggling to stay alert. Only David seemed unaffected by fatigue, sitting perfectly still with that unblinking stare, watching and waiting. That's when we heard the howling. It started low and far away, a sound that could have been wind through a canyon or a coyote's call. But as it grew closer, the howl revealed qualities no earthly animal could produce. It was multi-layered, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways, and underneath the main note was something that sounded horribly like human voices crying for help. David's head snapped toward the sound with inhuman speed, his neck rotating further than anatomy should allow. For just a moment, his carefully maintained human mask slipped, and I saw something else looking out through his eyes. Something ancient and hungry that regarded us as nothing more than meat. "We should check that out," he said, rising to his feet with that liquid grace. "Might be another camper in trouble." Every instinct I possessed screamed against following him into the darkness, but David was already walking toward the sound. Without our apparent leader, we faced a terrible choice: venture into the night-shrouded forest or remain by the fire, exposed and vulnerable. Jennifer made the decision for us. "We stick together," she said, grabbing a burning branch from the fire as a makeshift torch. "Nobody goes anywhere alone." We followed David into the trees, our footsteps crunching loudly on the carpet of fallen leaves while his remained eerily silent. The howling continued, sometimes seeming to come from directly ahead, other times circling around us like we were being herded. My flashlight beam kept catching glimpses of movement in the peripheral darkness, shapes that looked almost human but moved wrong, too fluid and angular. After what felt like hours of stumbling through increasingly dense undergrowth, we emerged into a clearing I didn't remember seeing during our earlier reconnaissance. In the center stood a massive ponderosa pine, its trunk so wide it would take 6 people holding hands to encircle it. The bark was scarred with deep gouges that formed disturbing patterns, almost like primitive hieroglyphs. David approached the tree with obvious familiarity, running his fingers along the carved symbols. "This place is old," he said, and for the first time since returning from his wood-gathering expedition, his voice carried genuine emotion. "Older than the people who named these mountains. Older than the stories they tell about what lives here." Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging deep enough to draw blood. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Look at his shadow." In the wavering light from Jennifer's torch, David's shadow fell across the scarred tree trunk. But instead of the familiar human silhouette we expected, the shadow had extra limbs, an elongated skull, and what looked like antlers or horns sprouting from its head. The shadow moved independently, gesturing and writhing while David stood perfectly still. That's when Robert broke. The pressure of the impossible situation finally shattered his logical worldview, and he began screaming, raw, primal sounds of terror that echoed through the forest. He turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush without regard for direction or obstacles. David's head swiveled to track Robert's flight with predatory interest. "He won't get far," he said matter-of-factly. "This place doesn't let people leave until it's finished with them." Almost immediately, we heard Robert's screaming take on a different quality. No longer fear, but agony. The sounds were coming from multiple directions at once, as if he was being attacked by several entities simultaneously. Then, abruptly, silence. Jennifer was hyperventilating, her torch wavering dangerously as her hands shook. "What do you want?" she demanded, addressing the thing wearing David's face. "What happened to our friend?" David smiled, that terrible, too wide smile. "Your friend volunteered. When I showed him what I really was, he begged me to take his place. Humans are so willing to sacrifice others to save themselves." His voice was changing now, becoming layered like the howling we'd heard earlier. But the hunger is never satisfied with just one. Sarah suddenly bolted, running not toward where Robert had disappeared but deeper into the forest. I could hear her crashing through the undergrowth, her progress marked by snapping branches and muffled sobs. David made no move to follow her, just continued smiling. "She'll circle back," he said conversationally. "They always do. The darkness confuses them, makes them lose direction. In an hour or two she'll stumble back here and we'll be waiting." Jennifer and I were alone with the creature now, standing in the shadow of the ancient tree while impossible sounds echoed from the surrounding darkness. I could hear what might have been Robert calling for help, but the voice was coming from a direction where no human could survive, directly overhead, as if he was somehow suspended in the forest canopy. "The old stories call me Yi Naldlushi," David continued, his voice now completely inhuman, a rasping whisper that seemed to come from multiple throats. "But your people simplified it to Skinwalker, a crude translation that misses the poetry of what I am." As he spoke, his human disguise began to deteriorate. His skin rippled like water, revealing glimpses of something dark and fur-covered underneath. His hands elongated, fingers stretching into claws that gleamed wetly in the torchlight. Most horrifying of all, his face began to shift, David's familiar features melting and reforming into something canine and predatory. Jennifer thrust her torch toward the creature, but instead of retreating, it laughed, a sound like breaking glass mixed with animal howling. "Fire can't hurt me, little one. Nothing you brought with you can hurt me. This is my place, older than your civilization, protected by laws your science doesn't recognize." The transformation was accelerating now. David's clothing split and fell away as his body stretched and contorted, bones cracking audibly as they reformed. Gray-brown fur sprouted across his skin, and his skull elongated into a lupine muzzle filled with too many teeth. But the worst part was that his eyes remained completely, recognizably human. David's brown eyes, wide with terror, trapped in a monster's face. I realized with horror that some part of David was still in there, conscious and aware, watching helplessly as his body was used for unspeakable purposes. The creature wasn't just wearing David's skin, it was keeping his soul as a trophy, a living witness to its own violation. "Run!" David's eyes seemed to plead, even as the creature's muzzle opened to reveal rows of glistening fangs. Jennifer and I didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted into the forest, leaving the clearing and its ancient tree behind. Branches whipped across our faces, drawing blood, and unseen roots sent us sprawling repeatedly. But we kept moving. Behind us, the creature that had been David was laughing, the sound following us through the trees like a hunting pack. The forest had become a maze. Paths that should have led back to our campsite instead curved in impossible directions, bringing us to clearings we'd never seen before, or depositing us at the edges of cliffs that shouldn't exist in this terrain. Our flashlights began to dim and flicker, though the batteries had been fresh when we started. We'd been running for perhaps 20 minutes when we heard Sarah screaming somewhere ahead. Following the sound, we pushed through a thicket of scrub oak and found her standing at the edge of another clearing, her hands pressed to her mouth in horror. In the center of the clearing was Robert, or what was left of him. He'd been suspended from a tree branch by some kind of rope or cord, but as we got closer, I realized the binding material was his own intestines, carefully extracted and wound around his ankles to hold his body upright. His chest cavity had been opened with surgical precision, ribs spread wide like the petals of a grotesque flower. But the most horrifying detail was that he was still alive, his eyes tracking our movement, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as he tried to speak. Carved into the tree trunk above his suspended form were fresh symbols, still bleeding sap, that matched the ancient markings we'd seen earlier. The message was clear. This was what happened to those who tried to run. Sarah was beyond coherent thought, making animal sounds of pure terror. Jennifer was vomiting violently, her torch dropped and sputtering in the damp leaves. I forced myself to approach Robert, hoping against hope that there was something we could do, some way to help him. That's when I saw the movement in his opened chest cavity. Something dark and many-legged was nesting inside his rib cage, feeding on his organs while keeping him alive through some supernatural means. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the plea there, not for rescue, but for release. I couldn't do it. Even with everything we'd witnessed, I couldn't bring myself to end Robert's suffering. Instead, I backed away, leaving him to whatever prolonged torment the creature had planned. The skinwalker's laughter echoed through the trees again, closer now. It was playing with us, allowing us to witness the fate of those who defied it before claiming us for itself. I grabbed Sarah and Jennifer, pulling them away from Robert's suspended form, and we stumbled deeper into the nightmare forest. Time became meaningless. We might have been running for minutes or hours. The darkness never seemed to change, and our watches had stopped working along with all our other technology. The forest kept shifting around us, familiar landmarks appearing and disappearing like mirages. Several times we thought we'd found our original campsite, only to discover clearings that contained other horrors. Piles of bones arranged in ritualistic patterns, trees with human faces carved into their bark, pools of water that reflected scenes of violence and death instead of our own faces. Eventually, exhaustion forced us to stop. We huddled together in what might have been a natural depression in the ground, surrounded by fallen logs that provided minimal cover. Sarah had retreated completely into herself, rocking back and forth while humming a tuneless song. Jennifer was trying to rationalize what we'd experienced, muttering about hallucinogenic plants and mass hysteria, but her voice carried no conviction. That's when we heard David calling our names. Michael, Jennifer, Sarah. His voice carried through the trees, sounding perfectly normal, perfectly human. Where are you guys? I've been looking everywhere. For just a moment, hope flared in my chest. Maybe we'd been wrong. Maybe David had genuinely gotten lost gathering firewood, and everything else had been some kind of shared nightmare brought on by altitude and stress. Maybe Robert was back at camp, safe and whole, wondering where we'd gone. Then I remembered his eyes, David's terrified eyes staring out from a monster's face. "Over here," Jennifer called before I could stop her, her desperate need to believe in normalcy overriding her fear. She stood up, waving her arms, ready to run toward the sound of David's voice. The thing that stepped into our hiding place wasn't the fully transformed creature we'd fled from earlier. It had resumed David's human appearance, though imperfectly. His smile was too wide, his movements too fluid, and when he opened his mouth to speak, I caught glimpses of far too many teeth. "There you are," he said, his voice carrying that same wrong cadence we'd noticed earlier. "I've been so worried. This place can be dangerous at night." Sarah's humming stopped abruptly. She looked up at the false David with eyes that had seen too much, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly clear and rational. "You're not him. You're wearing his face, but you're not him." David's smile faltered for just a moment, and in that pause, I saw something flicker across his features. Genuine surprise that his deception had been detected so easily. Then the smile returned, wider than before. "Of course I'm David," he said, but his voice was layered now, harmonizing with itself. "Who else would I be?" "The man who came back isn't the man who left," Sarah continued, her tone conversational despite the madness in her eyes. "David Jones, employee ID 4472, hired 3 years ago from the Henderson accounting firm. Allergic to shellfish, drives a blue Honda Civic, has a scar on his left palm from a childhood accident involving a broken window. David, who laughs too loud at his own jokes and always brings donuts on Friday mornings." With each detail Sarah recited, the creature's human mask slipped a little more. Its skin began to ripple, and dark fur sprouted along its jawline. "David, who proposed to his girlfriend last month and spent 20 minutes showing us pictures of the ring," Sarah finished. "That David is gone. You killed him and stole his shape, but you can't steal his memories. You can't steal what made him human." The creature dropped its human disguise entirely, revealing the nightmare amalgamation of wolf and man that stood before us. But Sarah's words had accomplished something unexpected. They'd weakened it somehow. The thing looked less solid, its edges wavering like heat distortion. "Names have power," Sarah said, her voice gaining strength. "And you don't know his real name. You only know the surface, the appearance. You're a parasite wearing a stolen face." The skinwalker snarled, its voice now purely animal. But instead of attacking, it began to retreat, backing away from Sarah's words as if they were physical blows. I realized she was doing something the creature hadn't expected. She was fighting back with the very thing it had tried to steal. Our shared memories of David, our human connections, were somehow acting as a weapon against this ancient evil. David Jones, who cried during the documentary about penguins, Jennifer added, understanding what Sarah was attempting. David, who keeps a photo of his dead mother in his wallet and talks to it when he thinks no one is looking. The creature writhed as if in physical pain, its form becoming more translucent with each memory we reclaimed. But its retreat brought us no comfort because we could hear something else moving through the forest, multiple somethings, drawn by our voices and the skinwalker's distress. "There are more of them," I whispered, and Sarah nodded grimly. "This whole area is a feeding ground," she said. "We stumbled into a nest. They've been hunting here for centuries, maybe millennia. The old warnings were true. Some places are too old, too steeped in darkness for humans to safely enter." The sounds were getting closer now. Footsteps that didn't match human gaits, breathing that came in impossible rhythms, voices that almost but not quite sounded like people we knew. The forest around us was alive with predators, and we were trapped in the center of their territory. That's when Jennifer made a decision that probably saved our lives. She pulled out a small silver pendant she wore around her neck, a St. Christopher medal her grandmother had given her, and began reciting the Lord's Prayer. Not because she was particularly religious, but because it was something human, something pure, something that belonged entirely to our world and not to the ancient darkness surrounding us. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The approaching sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by angry hissing and what sounded like retreat. The skinwalker that had been David let out a howl of rage and frustration before melting back into the forest shadows. "It's not the Christianity," Sarah said quietly. "It's the faith itself, the connection to something larger than ourselves. They're parasites that feed on isolation and despair. Community, belief, shared humanity. Those things are poison to them." We spent the rest of the night huddled together, taking turns reciting memories, stories, anything that reinforced our humanity and our connections to the world beyond this nightmare forest. We talked about our families, our dreams, our fears and hopes. We reminded ourselves and each other who we were beneath the terror. As dawn approached, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift slightly. The impossible geography that had trapped us started to make sense again, and we found ourselves able to navigate by familiar landmarks. The forest was still dangerous, still wrong, but the absolute dominion of the creatures was weakening with the light. We made our way back to what had been our campsite, though it took us nearly 2 hours to cover what should have been a 20-minute walk. Our tents were gone, our supplies scattered and spoiled, but our vehicles had returned. They sat exactly where we'd left them, keys still in my pocket as if they'd never disappeared at all. We didn't discuss what had happened as we loaded into the cars. We didn't talk about David or Robert or the things we'd seen. We simply drove away from the Gila wilderness as fast as the mountain roads would allow, putting distance between ourselves and the ancient evil we'd awakened. The official investigation concluded that David Jones and Robert Johnson had become lost in the wilderness and died of exposure. Their bodies were never found, despite extensive search efforts involving helicopters, tracking dogs, and experienced mountain rescue teams. The investigators were professional and thorough, but they were looking for rational explanations in a place where rationality held no power. Sarah quit her job the day after we returned. She moved to a small town in Vermont, somewhere with old churches and strong community ties, somewhere the darkness would have trouble reaching. Jennifer transferred to our firm's Denver office, claiming she needed a change of scenery. We exchange emails occasionally, carefully avoiding any mention of that October weekend. I stayed in Albuquerque, but I've never been camping since. I can't even walk through the city's few wooded parks without feeling watched, without hearing whispers in languages that predate human civilization. Sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, I receive text messages from David's phone number, just a string of coordinates that, when I look them up, always point to remote wilderness areas. I've never responded to those messages, and I never will. The Navajo gas station attendant was right to shake his head when he saw our permits. Some places are not meant for human feet, and some hungers are too old and too deep to ever be satisfied. We survived because we remembered who we were, because we held on to our humanity when everything else was stripped away. But sometimes, in my dreams, I still see David's eyes staring out from a monster's face, pleading for a mercy I was too horrified to provide. And I know that somewhere in the Gila wilderness, in the shadow of that ancient scarred tree, something wearing his stolen skin is still waiting for the next group of unsuspecting campers to stumble into its domain. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Gila wilderness of New Mexico in October of last year. The three of us had been working together at Davidson & Associates accounting firm for almost 4 years when Derek suggested the camping trip. We'd been talking about getting away from the fluorescent lights and endless spreadsheets for months, but it was Derek who finally booked the permits and bought the gear. Sarah Chen, our office manager, had initially hesitated. She'd never been camping before, but Derek's enthusiasm was infectious. He'd grown up hiking these mountains with his grandfather, he said, and knew all the best spots. "Trust me," Derek had grinned, tapping the detailed topographical map spread across his cubicle desk. 3 days in the Gila, and you'll forget what Excel even looks like. I should have paid more attention to the locals in Silver City when we stopped for supplies. The elderly woman at the outdoor store kept glancing at our map, her weathered fingers drumming nervously against the counter as Derek pointed out our planned route. "You boys picked a hell of a time to head up there," she'd muttered, not quite meeting our eyes. "Been some unusual reports from that area lately." When Derek pressed her for details, she'd just shaken her head and made change for our purchases with hands that trembled slightly. "Just stay together, you hear? Don't go wandering off alone after dark." We'd laughed about it in the parking lot. Sarah had even done an exaggerated impression of the woman's warning, making spooky ghost sounds that had us in stitches. Looking back now, I can still hear that laughter echoing in my memory, and it sounds hollow and stupid and naive. The first day had been perfect. We'd hiked 6 miles into the wilderness along the Middle Fork Trail, following an old mining road that eventually deteriorated into little more than a deer path. Derek led us off the main trail around noon, consulting his GPS and the hand-drawn map his grandfather had left him. The autumn air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine and decomposing leaves. Sarah kept stopping to take pictures with her phone while she still had signal, exclaiming over the golden aspens and the way the afternoon light filtered through the canopy. Our campsite was in a small meadow surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, with a clear stream running along the eastern edge. Derek had chosen well. It was sheltered from the wind but open enough to avoid feeling claustrophobic. We set up our tents in a rough triangle, with the fire pit Derek and I built sitting in the center. By evening, we were lounging around a crackling fire, passing around a bottle of whiskey Derek had smuggled in his pack and telling embarrassing stories about our co-workers. "Remember when Johnson tried to impress that client by pretending he knew Spanish?" Sarah giggled, her cheeks flushed from the alcohol and the warmth of the fire. "And he accidentally told her that her husband looked like a beautiful goat." Even now, I can picture Derek's face in the firelight, animated and relaxed in a way I'd never seen him at the office. His usually perfectly styled hair was messy from the day's hike and there was pine sap on his expensive hiking jacket, but he looked genuinely happy. That was the last time I saw the real Derek. The problems started small. I woke up around 3 in the morning to use the bathroom and noticed that our fire had died down to barely glowing embers. That was strange. Derek had banked it properly before we'd turned in, and there should have been enough wood to keep it going until morning. The cold had already started seeping into the meadow, and I could see my breath misting in the pale starlight. As I stumbled back from the trees, I heard something that made me freeze mid-step. It was a sound like crying, but not quite right somehow. Too rhythmic, too controlled. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the stream, maybe 50 yards from our camp. I stood there for several minutes listening, but eventually convinced myself it was just the water running over rocks or maybe a screech owl in the distance. I rekindled the fire and went back to sleep, but my dreams were full of that sound, that not quite crying that seemed to echo from just beyond the edge of understanding. Morning brought fresh concerns. Sarah's expensive GPS watch had somehow reset itself overnight, showing a completely different set of coordinates than where we'd camped. Derek's phone was completely dead despite being fully charged the night before, and when I checked my own device, I found that the detailed topographical map we'd downloaded had somehow corrupted into useless digital static. Technology, Derek had shrugged, but I noticed he kept checking his grandfather's hand-drawn map more frequently than necessary. The second day's hike took us deeper into the wilderness, following game trails that seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at them. More than once, I was certain we'd pass the same distinctive lightning-struck pine tree, though Derek insisted we were making steady progress toward the high country overlook he wanted to show us. Sarah's mood had started to shift. The cheerful chatter of the first day had given way to nervous silence, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if something was following us. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded curtly and picked up her pace. "There's something wrong with the wildlife," she said during our lunch break, gesturing toward the forest around us. "Have you noticed? No birds, no squirrels. It's like everything ran away." She was right. The forest was unnaturally quiet, filled with the kind of oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees were holding their breath. That evening, things got worse. We'd made camp in another small clearing, this one surrounded by dense stands of oak and pine that blocked out most of the dying sunlight. The shadows fell quickly and seemed thicker than they should have been, and by the time we got our fire built, full darkness had settled over us like a suffocating blanket. "I'll get more firewood," Derek announced after we'd finished a quiet dinner of freeze-dried chili and crackers. "There's a deadfall about a quarter-mile back along the trail that should have plenty of dry branches." "I'll come with you," I offered, but he waved me off. "No need. I've got my headlamp, and I know exactly where it is. Keep Sarah company and make sure nothing steals our food while I'm gone." He disappeared into the darkness beyond our fire's reach, and we could hear his footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves for maybe 30 seconds before the forest swallowed the sound completely. That was at 7:30 p.m. I know because Sarah checked her watch and commented that we should have the firewood cut and stacked before 8. By 9 o'clock, we were both nervous. By 10, we were scared. "Something's happened to him," Sarah kept saying, pacing back and forth at the edge of our firelight. "We should go look for him. He could be hurt." But I remembered the old woman's warning about staying together, and something deep in my gut told me that splitting up was exactly the wrong thing to do. The darkness beyond our camp felt alive somehow, watchful and patient and hungry. Every time a branch cracked in the distance or the wind stirred the leaves, we both jumped and stared into the black void between the trees. At 10:47 p.m., we heard Derek calling our names. His voice drifted out of the forest from the south, thin and distant, but unmistakably his. Sarah leapt to her feet and started to shout back, but I grabbed her arm. "Wait," I whispered. "Listen." We stood there straining our ears, and after a moment we heard it again. Derek's voice, calling for help, but from a completely different direction. Then again, from somewhere else entirely. The calls seemed to circle our camp, always just at the edge of hearing, always from the impenetrable darkness beyond our fire. "That's not right," Sarah breathed, her fingers digging into my forearm. "That's not... How is he in 3 places at once?" The calling continued for nearly an hour, always distant, always moving. Sometimes the voice sounded exactly like Derek. Sometimes it sounded like Derek but wrong somehow, the cadence slightly off or the tone just a little too high, and sometimes when the wind was blowing just right, it sounded like Derek screaming. Then, at 11:52 p.m., Derek walked back into our camp. "Sorry I took so long," he said, dropping an armload of firewood next to the pit. "Got turned around in the dark. This place is like a maze when you can't see the landmarks." Sarah ran to him and threw her arms around his waist, relief evident in every line of her body. "We were so worried. We heard you calling for help, but the sound kept moving around." Derek stiffened in her embrace. "I wasn't calling for help," he said slowly. "I was being quiet. Didn't want to attract any attention." Something cold crawled up my spine. Derek had always been a talker, the kind of person who hummed or whistled or made some kind of noise whenever he was nervous or working. The idea of him being deliberately quiet in a dark forest was completely out of character. But Sarah was so relieved to have him back that she didn't seem to notice. She helped him stack the firewood while chattering about how worried we'd been, and Derek nodded and made appropriate responses, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. It was the way he moved. Derek had always been slightly clumsy, the kind of guy who knocked over coffee cups and bumped into door frames. But now his movements were too fluid, too controlled, like a predator trying to mimic human awkwardness. And his eyes. His eyes reflected the firelight in a way that human eyes shouldn't. "Derek," I said carefully, "where exactly did you go for the firewood?" He turned to look at me, and for just a split second his face was completely blank. No recognition, no personality, nothing human at all. Then the expression flickered back and he was smiling his familiar lopsided smile. "Back along the trail, like I said, found a whole tree that had fallen across a ravine, tons of good dry wood." He gestured toward the pile he'd brought back. "Should be enough to keep us warm all night." I looked at the firewood he'd gathered. It was all wrong. The branches were too uniform, too perfectly sized, and they were all from the same type of tree, a species I was pretty sure didn't grow anywhere near our campsite. More troubling, they were all completely free of bark and had a strange oily sheen that made them look almost wet in the firelight. "That's great," I said, forcing my voice to stay casual. "We were really worried when we heard you calling for help." "I told you, I wasn't calling for help." Derek's smile never wavered, but there was something sharp behind his eyes now. "Maybe you heard something else. These mountains can play tricks on people." Sarah looked back and forth between us, confusion written across her face. "But we both heard it. Your voice, calling our names. You must have been mistaken." Derek's voice was perfectly pleasant, but there was a finality to it that killed the conversation. He picked up one of the strange branches and tossed it onto the fire. The flames immediately changed color, shifting from orange and yellow to a sickly green that made our skin look corpse pale. The wood didn't crackle and pop like normal firewood. It burned with an eerie silence that was somehow worse than any sound. "Pretty," Derek said, staring into the unnatural flames with obvious satisfaction. "Don't you think it's pretty?" Neither Sarah nor I answered. We were both transfixed by the horror of what we were seeing, but Derek seemed completely oblivious to our fear. He settled down on his sleeping bag and continued feeding the strange wood into the fire, humming tunelessly under his breath. That's when I noticed he was humming a song I'd never heard before. The melody was wrong somehow, full of intervals that hurt to listen to and rhythms that seemed to bypass the ears and go straight into the brainstem. Sarah was swaying slightly in time with the music, her eyes fixed on the dancing green flames, and I realized with growing terror that whatever had come back from the forest wasn't Derek at all. I grabbed Sarah's hand and squeezed hard, trying to break her out of whatever trance she was falling into. She blinked and looked at me, and I saw my own fear reflected in her eyes. "I'm tired," I announced loudly, standing up and pulling Sarah with me. "I think we should all get some sleep." Derek stopped humming and turned to look at us. In the green firelight, his face looked cadaverous, all sharp angles and deep shadows. "Sleep sounds good," he agreed, "but someone should keep watch, just to be safe." "I'll take first watch," I said quickly. "You two get some rest." Derek smiled again, and this time I could see that his teeth were different. Too sharp, too many of them. "That's very thoughtful of you, Michael. Very considerate." The way he said my name made my skin crawl. It was like hearing a recording of a human voice played backwards, recognizable but fundamentally wrong. Sarah and I retreated to our tents, but I had no intention of sleeping. I lay in my sleeping bag with my eyes open, listening to the sounds of the camp. Derek moved around the fire for a while longer, occasionally adding more of the strange wood and humming that awful melody. Eventually, I heard him unzip his tent and crawl inside. For about an hour, everything was quiet except for the unnatural crackling of the fire. Then I heard Derek's tent zipper again. I carefully unzipped a small section of my own tent and peered out. The thing that looked like Derek was standing at the edge of our camp, perfectly motionless, staring into the forest. Its head was cocked at an unnatural angle, like it was listening for something the rest of us couldn't hear. As I watched, it began to change. The transformation was gradual at first. Derek's familiar features seemed to blur and shift, like looking at someone through disturbed water. His proportions began to alter, arms growing longer, fingers stretching into claws. His back hunched and elongated, and when he turned his head, I could see that his face had become something else entirely. The skin was gray and mottled, stretched tight over bones that were all wrong, and his eyes were black pits that seemed to absorb the firelight. But the worst part was that it still moved with Derek's mannerisms. It still stood with the same slight slouch, still tilted its head the same way when it was thinking. Whatever this thing was, it had studied Derek carefully enough to copy his behaviors, even while wearing its true form. I must have made some small sound, a gasp or a whimper, because the creature's head snapped around to stare directly at my tent. For several heart-stopping seconds, we looked at each other through the thin fabric, and I was certain it could see me as clearly as I could see it. Then it smiled Derek's lopsided smile with a mouth full of needle-sharp teeth and began walking toward my tent. I grabbed my hiking boots and the small camping knife I'd brought for cutting rope, then carefully worked my way to the back of the tent and cut a slit in the fabric just large enough to crawl through. The thing that had been Derek was still approaching from the front, moving with a predator's patience, so I had maybe 30 seconds before it realized I wasn't inside anymore. I crawled on my belly to Sarah's tent and pressed my mouth close to the fabric near where I thought her head would be. "Sarah," I whispered as quietly as I could. "Sarah, wake up. Don't make any noise, but we need to go. Right now." I heard her stirring inside, and a moment later, her frightened voice, "Michael, what's happening?" "Derek isn't Derek anymore. Something's wrong with him. Cut your way out the back of your tent and meet me by the stream. Bring your boots and anything you can use as a weapon." There was a pause, and then I heard the soft sound of fabric being cut. Good. Sarah had always been quick to adapt to crisis situations. It's what made her such a good office manager. I crept toward the stream, using the sound of running water to mask any noise I might make. Behind me, I could hear the Derek thing moving around our camp, and then a sound that made my blood freeze. The unmistakable noise of tent fabric being shredded by claws. A moment later, the creature let out a howl of rage that was barely human. It had discovered my escape route. Sarah appeared beside me a few seconds later, her face pale in the starlight but her hands steady as she laced up her hiking boots. She was carrying her tent stakes like weapons, and had somehow managed to grab her small backpack. "What is that thing?" she whispered. "I don't know, but we need to put as much distance between us and it as possible." From back at the camp, we could hear the Derek thing destroying our remaining gear, growling and snarling like an animal. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. "Mike?" Derek's voice called out, sounding perfectly normal and concerned. "Sarah, where are you guys? I woke up and your tents were empty. Are you okay?" Sarah started to respond, but I clamped my hand over her mouth and shook my head frantically. Whatever that thing was, it was trying to lure us back. "I'm worried about you," the voice continued, and now it sounded like Derek was crying. "Please, I don't know what happened. I think I might have been sleepwalking or something. I'm scared and confused, and I need help." The performance was perfect. If I hadn't seen the creature's true form, I would have believed every word. But I had seen it, and I knew that whatever was wearing Derek's face was something far older and more malevolent than a confused human being. We started moving downstream, using the sound of the water to cover our footsteps. I had no idea where we were going or how we'd find our way back to civilization, but staying anywhere near that thing was not an option. For the first hour, we moved in silence, following the stream through increasingly dense forest. The moon was just a sliver, providing barely enough light to avoid the worst obstacles, and more than once we had to stop and feel our way around fallen trees or rocky outcroppings. Behind us, Derek's voice continued to call out periodically, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes sobbing with apparent grief. The sound seemed to follow us no matter how far we traveled, always staying just at the edge of hearing. "It's tracking us," Sarah whispered during one of our brief rest stops. "How is it tracking us?" I didn't have an answer. We were moving through water whenever possible to avoid leaving scent trails, and we'd been careful not to break branches or leave other obvious signs of our passage. But somehow, the creature always seemed to know roughly where we were. Around dawn, we heard something that made us both freeze in terror. Derek's voice was calling out from ahead of us now, not behind. Somehow, the thing had gotten in front of us. "That's impossible," Sarah breathed. "We never doubled back. We've been following the stream the whole time." But as the sky began to lighten, we could see that we were in completely unfamiliar territory. The landscape around us was wrong. Too rocky, too barren, like we'd somehow walked into a different climate zone overnight. The trees were stunted and twisted, and there was an odd smell in the air, like sulfur mixed with rotting meat. And there, sitting on a boulder about 50 yards downstream, was Derek. He looked perfectly normal in the morning light, tired and dirty from a night in the forest, but unmistakably the colleague we'd worked with for 4 years. When he saw us, his face lit up with relief and he waved enthusiastically. "There you are. I've been looking for you all night. What happened? Why did you leave camp?" Sarah started toward him, but I grabbed her arm. "Look at his reflection," I whispered. The stream near Derek's boulder was perfectly still, creating a mirror-like surface. Derek's reflection was there, but it was wrong. While Derek himself appeared normal, his reflection showed the creature's true form: gray skin, elongated limbs, and those terrible black eyes. Sarah saw it too and stumbled backwards, nearly falling into the water. Derek's expression didn't change, but his head tilted slightly. "What's wrong? You both look terrified." "Stay away from us," I called out, raising my camping knife. "We know what you are." Derek looked genuinely confused. "What I am?" "Mike, I'm Derek. Your friend Derek. I think you might be having some kind of breakdown. The stress of being lost, maybe, or altitude sickness." The performance was still flawless, but I'd seen the reflection. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human, and it definitely wasn't our friend. "If you're really Derek," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady, "then tell us about the Johnson account, the one you closed last month." Derek smiled. "Easy. Johnson Manufacturing, industrial cleaning supplies. I landed them after 3 months of negotiations, and the commission put me over quota for the quarter." It was exactly right, every detail perfect. But Sarah shook her head. "Derek hated that account," she said quietly. "He complained about it constantly, said Johnson was demanding and cheap, and that the commission barely made up for the headaches. The real Derek would never describe it as a success." Derek's smile faltered for just a moment. Well, I was trying to be positive about it. You know how I am, always looking on the bright side." But we both knew that Derek was a chronic complainer who never looked on the bright side of anything. The thing wearing his face had access to his memories, but not his personality. "What are you?" I demanded. Derek stood up from the boulder, and as he did, his form began to shift again. The human facade melted away like wax, revealing the creature underneath. It was even more horrifying in daylight, nearly 8 feet tall with skin like dried leather and fingers that ended in curved talons. Its face was a nightmare amalgamation of human and animal features, with Derek's eyes floating in a skull that belonged to something else entirely. "Your friend was delicious," it said, and now its voice was Derek's voice layered over something else, something that sounded like grinding bone and tearing flesh. Full of such interesting memories, such fears, I particularly enjoyed the one about his father leaving when he was 7. All that abandonment trauma, seasoned with years of self-doubt and inadequacy. Sarah made a sound like a wounded animal, and I realized she was crying. But don't worry, the creature continued, starting to walk toward us with predatory grace. I'll be sure to savor your memories just as thoroughly. Sarah, your recurring nightmare about drowning looks particularly appetizing. And Michael. Oh, Michael. All that guilt about your brother's accident. All those years of wondering if you could have saved him. I'm going to feast on that guilt for decades. It was too much. The casual mention of our deepest fears and traumas, delivered in Derek's familiar voice, broke something inside me. I found myself screaming. Not words, just pure rage and terror as I charged at the creature with my pathetic camping knife. The thing moved faster than anything that size should have been able to move. One moment I was running toward it. The next I was flying through the air, my ribs on fire where its claws had raked across my chest. I hit a tree trunk hard enough to see stars, and by the time my vision cleared, the creature was standing over Sarah. She was on her knees in the shallow water, looking up at the thing with a mixture of terror and defiance that would have made me proud if I wasn't bleeding and probably dying. "Just make it quick," she said. The creature laughed. Derek's laugh, but wrong, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Quick? Oh, my dear Sarah, I've been so hungry for so long. I'm going to take my time with both of you." It reached down toward her with one clawed hand, and that's when Sarah showed me why she'd risen to management level at our firm despite being the youngest person in the office. Instead of flinching away, she drove one of her tent stakes straight up into the creature's wrist with all her strength. The thing shrieked and jerked backward, black blood spurting from the wound. The sound it made was unlike anything I'd ever heard, part animal roar, part human scream, and part something else that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper and darker than this world. "Iron," Sarah gasped, staring at the tent stake now slick with dark blood. "It's vulnerable to iron." The creature was clutching its wounded arm, and for the first time since this nightmare began, it looked genuinely surprised and hurt. But the injury also seemed to have made it angry in a way that was beyond human understanding. "Clever little morsel," it snarled, and now Derek's voice was completely gone, replaced by something that sounded like grinding stone. "I was going to make this relatively painless, but now I think I'll start with your fingers. One joint at a time." I forced myself to stand, ignoring the fire in my chest and the warm wetness spreading across my shirt. Sarah's discovery had given us a chance, maybe our only chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. My backpack had been torn apart during the creature's first attack, but I could see my emergency supplies scattered across the ground, including the small hatchet I'd brought for cutting firewood. The creature was advancing on Sarah again, moving more cautiously now but still confident in its superiority. It was so focused on her that it didn't notice me limping toward the scattered gear. My fingers closed around the hatchet's handle just as the thing reached for Sarah with its uninjured hand. I put every ounce of strength I had left into my swing, aiming for what I hoped was its spine. The iron head of the hatchet bit deep into the creature's back, and the effect was immediate and devastating. The thing convulsed like it had been electrocuted, its scream shattering the morning silence and sending every bird within miles fleeing into the sky. It spun around to face me, and I saw that where Derek's eyes had been, there were now just empty sockets leaking black fluid. But it wasn't dead, not even close. "You cannot kill me, little man," it hissed, reaching back to pull the hatchet from its back. "I am older than your civilization. I was hunting in these mountains when your ancestors were still afraid of fire. Maybe it was right, maybe we couldn't kill it. But Sarah had already proven we could hurt it, and hurt things could be slowed down, could be escaped from. The GPS," I said urgently to Sarah. "Check your GPS, see if you can get a signal." She fumbled with her watch while I kept the creature's attention by waving my bloody camping knife at it. The thing seemed to find my defiance amusing rather than threatening. "No signal," Sarah said. "But I think I know where we are." This is the area my watch was showing yesterday, the coordinates that were wrong. We've been walking in circles." The creature laughed again. "Of course you have. These are my mountains now. Space works differently here. Time works differently. You could walk for days and never leave this valley." It was toying with us now, confident that we were trapped. But there was something in the way it said "my mountains" that gave me an idea. "You're not from here originally," I said, backing slowly toward the stream. "You're something else, something that doesn't belong. That's why iron hurts you. That's why you had to steal Derek's form instead of just appearing as yourself." The creature's eyeless sockets somehow managed to convey annoyance. "Clever boy. Yes, I am. From elsewhere. But I have claimed this place now, made it mine through ritual and blood." "Ritual and blood," I repeated, and suddenly I understood. Derek wasn't your first victim, was he? You've been taking people for a while now. That's what the woman in Silver City was trying to warn us about. "She knew nothing," the creature spat. "She only suspected. But yes, there have been others. Hikers, campers, hunters. I needed their forms, their memories, to perfect my disguise. Your friend Derek was simply the most recent addition to my collection." Sarah had been edging toward the stream while the creature focused on me, and now she was standing in the running water with her remaining tent stakes ready. I saw her nod slightly. She'd figured out what I was thinking. "Iron disrupts your connection to this place," I said, taking another step back. "That's why the tent stakes hurt you so much. It's not just that you're vulnerable to iron. Iron breaks whatever supernatural claim you have on the area." The creature's form was starting to shift again, becoming larger and more monstrous as its anger grew. "Enough talk. I'm tired of playing with my food." It lunged toward me with inhuman speed, but I was ready. Instead of trying to dodge, I dove sideways into the stream, right where Sarah was waiting with her improvised weapons. The creature followed me into the water, and the moment its feet touched the stream bed, Sarah drove both tent stakes deep into its legs. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. The thing's scream was so loud and intense that I felt it in my bones, and the very air around us seemed to ripple and distort. The landscape began to change. The twisted trees started to straighten and become normal pines and oaks. The sulfurous smell faded, replaced by the clean scent of mountain air. And in the distance, I could see the real trail, the one we'd been hiking on 2 days ago. The creature was thrashing in the water, its form becoming less solid with each passing second. I could see through it in places, as if it was dissolving from the inside out. "This isn't possible," it gasped. "I've held this place for decades. I've fed here, grown strong here." "Maybe," I said, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her toward shore, "but you never belonged here, and now you're going back where you came from." We ran. I don't know how far or for how long, but we ran through forest that was finally normal again, following a trail that actually went somewhere. Behind us, the creature's screams gradually faded, replaced by a sound like wind rushing through a vast, empty space. We didn't stop running until we saw the ranger station. The official report listed Derek as missing, presumed dead. Search teams found our destroyed campsite and evidence of some kind of animal attack, but no trace of what had happened to our friend. Sarah and I told them that Derek had gone to gather firewood and never came back, that we'd waited as long as we could before hiking out for help. It was close enough to the truth. Sarah quit her job 2 weeks later and moved back east to live with her sister. We email occasionally, but we never talk about what happened in the Gila wilderness. Some things are too big and too terrible to fit into words. I still work at Davidson & Associates, but I requested a transfer to a different department. I couldn't handle walking past Derek's empty cubicle every day, couldn't stand the way his family photos and motivational posters sat untouched for months after he disappeared, like a shrine to someone who had never really existed in the first place. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if the creature was telling the truth about having Derek's memories. I wonder if somewhere in whatever realm it came from, some echo of my friend still exists, trapped forever inside a monster that wears his face. But mostly, I try not to think about it at all. The thing that haunts me most isn't the creature itself, or even the memory of Derek's death. It's the knowledge that there are places in this world where reality works differently, where the rules we depend on simply don't apply. Places where something hungry and ancient can reach through from somewhere else and take everything that makes you human, leaving behind only a shell that moves and talks and remembers but isn't really you anymore. I don't go camping anymore. I don't even like being alone in my apartment after dark, because sometimes when the wind is blowing just right and the shadows fall at the wrong angle, I swear I can hear Derek's voice calling my name from somewhere very far away. And sometimes I'm afraid that someday I might answer. My name is Stephen Robinson, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Gila Wilderness of southwestern New Mexico, in a place where the ancient ponderosa pines grow so thick they block out the sun even at midday. I worked for Meridian Tech Solutions in Albuquerque, doing network security for mid-size companies. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me in a decent apartment with a view of the Sandia Mountains. Our team had been struggling with morale after a series of brutal deadlines and a particularly nasty client who seemed to think we were miracle workers. So, when our manager, Jennifer Williams, suggested a team-building camping trip, we all grudgingly agreed. "It'll be good for us," Jennifer had said, her auburn hair catching the fluorescent office lights as she spread a topographical map across the conference table. "Fresh air, no cell service, just us and nature. We can actually talk to each other for once instead of hiding behind our monitors." The team was small, just 5 of us. There was Jennifer, our project manager, a woman in her early 40s who approached everything with military precision. She'd been divorced twice and had no kids, so work was her life. Michael Williams, no relation to Jennifer despite the shared surname, was our lead developer, a quiet guy with prematurely gray hair who lived alone with 3 cats and had an encyclopedic knowledge of horror movies. Ashley Robinson was our QA specialist, 28 years old with bright green eyes and a laugh that could light up a room, though she'd been quieter lately after her father's death 6 months prior. And then there was Kevin King. Kevin was our newest hire, brought in 3 months ago to handle client relations. He was one of those guys who seemed perfect on paper. 32, athletic build, easy smile, the kind of person who could sell ice to Eskimos. But there was something about him that bothered me, though I could never put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or how he had a habit of standing just a little too close when he talked to you. Ashley seemed taken with him, which only made my unease worse. The plan was simple. Drive down to the Gila Wilderness, hike in about 6 miles to a remote campsite near Turkey Creek, spend 3 days bonding, and hike back out. Jennifer had gotten all the permits, studied the maps, even downloaded offline GPS coordinates to her phone. We'd done group camping before, company retreats to state parks with bathhouses and cell towers. This was different. This was wilderness with a capital W. We left Albuquerque early on a Friday morning in October. The 5 of us packed into Jennifer's Suburban with enough gear for a week, even though we'd only be out for 3 days. The drive took us south through Socorro, then west into increasingly desolate country. The landscape changed from high desert scrub to rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon, then finally to the towering ponderosa pines of the Gila. The forest seemed to swallow us whole. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars, their trunks so massive it would take 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered down through the canopy, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that should have been beautiful, but somehow felt oppressive. The deeper we drove, the more the silence seemed to press in around us. "Jesus," Michael muttered from the passenger seat, craning his neck to look up at the trees. It's like something out of a Lovecraft story. Lovecraft was all about cosmic horror, Kevin said from behind me, his voice carrying that lecture tone he got sometimes. Ancient, unknowable things that drove men mad. This is just trees. Just trees that are older than Christianity, Michael shot back. Some of these ponderosas have been here for 600–700 years. Think about all the things they've seen." Ashley shifted beside me in the back seat. "Could we maybe not talk about ancient, unknowable things before we've even set up camp?" I glanced at her in the side mirror. Her face was pale and she was gripping the door handle with white knuckles. I'd forgotten about her claustrophobia. Something about the way the forest seemed to close in around us was probably triggering it. "We're almost to the trailhead," Jennifer said, consulting her GPS. "Another 2 miles." But 2 miles turned into 5, then 8. The GPS kept recalculating, sending us down increasingly narrow dirt roads that seemed to lead nowhere. Jennifer's jaw got tighter with each wrong turn, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "This is impossible," she finally said, pulling over at what might charitably be called a clearing. "According to this, we should be at the trailhead, but there's nothing here." Kevin unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned forward to peer at the GPS display. "Technology fails," he said simply. "That's why the old ways are better." Something about the way he said "old ways" made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, though I couldn't say why. There was an inflection there, almost like he was talking about something specific rather than just making conversation. We got out to stretch our legs and consult the paper maps Jennifer had brought as backup. The air was crisp and thin at this elevation, probably around 8,000 feet, and carried scents of pine resin and decomposing leaves. But underneath those familiar forest smells was something else, something animal and wrong that made my stomach turn. "We must have missed a turn," Jennifer said, spreading the topographical map on the hood of the Suburban. "If we're here," she pointed to a spot on the map, "then the trail should be about 3 miles back the way we came." "Are you sure that's where we are?" Ashley asked. She'd wrapped her arms around herself and was scanning the tree line with nervous eyes. "The GPS says," Jennifer started, then stopped. The device was showing our location as a blank gray area. No roads, no landmarks, nothing. "That's weird. It was working fine a minute ago." Michael was walking in slow circles around the clearing, his head tilted like he was listening for something. "Does anyone else hear that?" We all stopped talking and listened. At first, there was only the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the distant call of a raven. But then I heard it too. A rhythmic tapping, like someone hammering on wood. "Woodpecker?" Ashley suggested hopefully. "Wrong rhythm," Michael said, "and it's too regular. Woodpeckers don't tap like that." The sound came again, 3 sharp raps followed by a pause, then 3 more raps. It seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, though it was impossible to pinpoint the direction. "We should get back on the road," I said. "Find the actual trailhead before it gets dark." But when we tried to start the Suburban, it wouldn't turn over. Jennifer turned the key again and again, but the engine just clicked uselessly. "Pop the hood," Kevin said. "I'll take a look." He spent 10 minutes poking around the engine bay while the rest of us stood around feeling useless. The hammering sound had stopped, but now there was something worse. An absolute silence that felt unnatural in a forest that should have been alive with bird calls and rustling leaves. "Battery cables are corroded," Kevin finally announced, wiping his hands on a rag. "Weird, though. They were fine this morning." Jennifer pulled out her cell phone to call for help, but of course there was no signal. None of our phones showed even a single bar. "So, what do we do?" Ashley asked. Her voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Kevin straightened up from the engine bay and looked around the clearing with an expression I couldn't read. "We make the best of it," he said. "Set up camp here for the night. Figure out the car situation in the morning." "Here?" Ashley's voice cracked. "We're not even at a campsite. We don't know where we are." "We're in the Gila Wilderness," Kevin said patiently. "Dispersed camping is allowed anywhere that's more than 100 yards from water sources. This clearing looks perfect." There was something wrong with his tone. Too calm, too assured, like he'd expected this to happen. But Jennifer was already nodding and pulling gear from the back of the Suburban. "Kevin's right," she said. "It's getting late anyway. We'll make camp, get some sleep, and deal with the car in the morning." We set up our tents in a rough circle around a fire ring that Kevin built with stones from a nearby creek bed. I hadn't even noticed the creek before. It was just a thin trickle of water running through a cut in the rocky ground. But Kevin had found it immediately, like he'd known exactly where to look. As the sun disappeared behind the towering pines, the temperature dropped fast. We gathered around the fire Kevin had started with what seemed like supernatural efficiency. No paper, no kindling, just a match touched to a pile of sticks that shouldn't have caught so easily. "So," Jennifer said, trying to inject some forced cheer into her voice, "team building exercise number 1. Let's go around the circle and share something about ourselves that the others don't know." It was the kind of corporate icebreaker that would have made us all groan back at the office, but out here in the wilderness with darkness pressing in around our small circle of firelight, it felt almost desperately necessary to hear human voices. Michael went first. "I have a recurring nightmare about being buried alive," he said. "Had it since I was a kid. Same dream every time. I'm in a coffin, but I can hear voices above me, and I'm trying to scream, but no sound comes out." Ashley shuddered. "Jesus, Mike, way to keep things light." "Your turn," Michael said. Ashley stared into the fire for a long moment. "After my dad died," she said quietly, "I started seeing him everywhere. At the grocery store, walking down the street, standing in my backyard. Always just for a second and always just far enough away that I couldn't be sure. The doctors said it was normal, part of the grief process, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. Jennifer cleared her throat. "I'll go next. I'm afraid of the dark. Not just uncomfortable. Actually, genuinely terrified. Have been since I was 7 and got locked in a basement during a tornado. Spent 6 hours in complete blackness, listening to the house getting torn apart above me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air." "Why didn't you tell us that before we planned a camping trip?" "Because I'm good at managing my fears," Jennifer said sharply. "As long as we keep the fire going, I'll be fine." All eyes turned to me. I tried to think of something relatively innocuous to share, but what came out of my mouth surprised me. "I think Kevin is lying about something," I said. "I don't know what, but something about him doesn't add up." The silence that followed was deafening. Kevin just smiled that easy smile of his and shook his head. "Paranoid much, Stephen?" he said. "What exactly do you think I'm lying about?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But when the GPS stopped working and you said the old ways are better, it sounded like you knew something we didn't, and you found that creek awfully fast for someone who's never been here before." Kevin's smile never wavered. "Your turn," he said to Ashley. "Wait," I said. "What about Kevin? He didn't share anything." "I shared plenty," Kevin said. "I told you all that technology fails and the old ways are better. I told you that dispersed camping is allowed in the Gila. I told you about the creek." He leaned forward and the firelight made his eyes look black and depthless. "What more do you want to know?" Before anyone could answer, we heard it again, the rhythmic hammering from somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps, pause. But this time it sounded closer. "There," Ashley whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "Did you see that?" I squinted into the darkness where she was pointing but saw nothing except the black shapes of trees. "See what?" "A light, like a flashlight, but..." She paused, frowning. "It was the wrong color. Too blue." Michael stood up and grabbed his own flashlight from his tent. "I'll go check it out." "No," Jennifer said sharply. "Nobody goes anywhere alone. We stay together." "It's probably just another camper," Kevin said. "We're not the only people in the forest." But even as he said it, we all knew it wasn't true. We'd driven for miles without seeing another soul, and the GPS had shown no marked campsites anywhere near this area. The hammering stopped abruptly, leaving only the crackle of our fire and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Then, from somewhere behind Ashley's tent came the sound of breaking branches, something large moving through the underbrush. "Elk?" Michael suggested hopefully. "Wrong time of year," Kevin said. "An elk don't break branches like that. Too graceful." As if in response to his words, we heard a sound that made my blood freeze in my veins. A low, warbling call that started almost human, but twisted into something animal and hungry. It seemed to come from all around us, echoing off the trees until it was impossible to tell which direction it had originated from. Ashley grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin through my jacket. What the hell was that? "Coyote," Kevin said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They make all kinds of weird sounds." I'd heard coyotes before, plenty of times during camping trips in Colorado and Arizona. This wasn't a coyote. This was something else entirely, something that had learned to imitate human speech just well enough to be deeply, fundamentally wrong. We spent the rest of the evening huddled around the fire, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond our circle of light. Jennifer kept feeding more wood to the flames, her movements sharp and nervous. Michael tried to lighten the mood with stories from work, but his voice kept cracking, and he couldn't seem to finish any of them. Around midnight, Kevin announced he was going to bed. "You sure that's a good idea?" I asked. "Maybe we should take shifts, keep the fire going." "Fire's not going anywhere," Kevin said, "and we need our rest if we're going to figure out the car situation tomorrow." He unzipped his tent and crawled inside, leaving the rest of us staring at each other across the dying flames. "I don't want to be alone," Ashley whispered. "You won't be," Jennifer said. "We'll keep the fire going all night, take 2-hour shifts." But despite our best intentions, exhaustion won out. I took the first watch, feeding small branches to the fire and trying not to look directly into the darkness beyond its reach. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed amplified and threatening. When Michael shook me awake for my shift change, I realized I'd been dozing against a log for God knows how long. The fire had burned down to coals, and the darkness around us felt thick and oppressive. "Sorry," I mumbled. "How long was I out?" "Don't know," Michael whispered. "I just woke up and saw the fire was almost dead." We built it back up together, neither of us willing to admit how scared we were. The silence in the forest was complete now. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. Just the crackle of burning wood and our own breathing. "Stephen," Michael said quietly, "what you said earlier about Kevin. I think you're right." I looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He knew about that creek, and when he was looking at the car engine, I saw him disconnect the battery cables, not fix them. My blood went cold. "You saw him sabotage the car?" "I think so. I wasn't sure at the time, but looking back..." Michael trailed off, staring into the fire. Why would he do that? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a tent zipper being pulled down. Kevin emerged from his tent, fully dressed, and walked past us toward the tree line without a word. "Kevin," I called out, "where are you going?" He didn't answer, didn't even seem to hear me. He just kept walking until the darkness swallowed him whole. Michael and I looked at each other across the fire. "Should we wake the others?" Michael whispered. "Let's give him a few minutes," I said. "Maybe he just needed to take a leak." But 20 minutes passed, then 30, with no sign of Kevin returning. The fire was burning bright and warm, but the cold seemed to be seeping in around the edges, bringing with it that animal smell I'd noticed earlier, musky and predatory. "We have to wake Jennifer and Ashley," I finally said. But when we unzipped Jennifer's tent, we found it empty. Her sleeping bag was there, still warm, but she was gone. Ashley's tent was the same. Empty sleeping bag, no sign of where she'd gone. Michael grabbed my arm, his fingers shaking. "This isn't possible. We would have heard them leave. Maybe they went to look for Kevin." "Without telling us? Without flashlights?" Michael shone his light around the campsite. All the flashlights were still here, along with everyone's boots and jackets. That's when we heard the hammering again, but this time it was different. Instead of the rhythmic 3-rap pattern, it was chaotic and frantic, like someone pounding desperately on wood. "That's coming from the creek," Michael said. We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the sound, calling out for our missing teammates. The creek was only about 50 yards from our campsite, but it felt like miles in the darkness. Our flashlight beams seemed pathetically weak against the wall of black trees surrounding us. We found Jennifer first. She was kneeling beside the creek, her back to us, perfectly still. In the flashlight beam, I could see that she was fully dressed and her hair was neatly combed as if she'd gotten ready for work instead of stumbling out of a tent in the middle of the night. "Jennifer," I called out, "what are you doing?" She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear us. She just knelt there, motionless, staring down at the water. Michael and I approached slowly, our flashlights trained on her back. As we got closer, I could see what she was looking at. Something pale floating just beneath the surface of the creek. It was Ashley. She was face down in the shallow water, her long brown hair fanned out around her head like seaweed. But here's the thing that made my mind refuse to process what I was seeing. She was wearing her pajamas, the same ones she'd had on when she went to bed. Yet here was Jennifer, fully dressed, kneeling beside the creek like she'd been there for hours. "Jesus Christ," Michael breathed. "Jennifer, what happened? How long have you been here?" Jennifer turned to look at us then, and my heart stopped. It was Jennifer's face, Jennifer's body, Jennifer's clothes. But the eyes were wrong. They were too dark, too deep, and when she smiled, I could see too many teeth. "She fell," Jennifer said in Jennifer's voice. "Poor thing, she was walking in her sleep." "Bullshit," I said, backing away. "Ashley doesn't sleepwalk. And how did you get dressed so fast?" The thing wearing Jennifer's face tilted its head to one side, the movement too fluid, too bird-like to be human. "I've been waiting here," it said, "waiting for you to come find me." Michael had his flashlight trained on the water where Ashley's body floated. "Stephen," he whispered, "look at her feet." I looked. Ashley's feet were pointing the wrong way, not just twisted, but completely reversed, as if her legs had been broken and reassembled backwards. "That's not how people drown," Michael said. The Jennifer thing stood up slowly, water dripping from her knees. "No," it agreed, "it's not." I grabbed Michael's arm and we ran. Behind us, I could hear the thing that looked like Jennifer laughing, a sound like breaking glass and rushing water. We crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at our clothes and faces, our flashlights bobbing wildly in the darkness. We made it back to the campsite, but it was wrong. The fire was out, the tents were gone, and there was no sign that we'd ever been there at all. Just a clearing in the forest with a ring of stones that looked like they'd been there for decades. "This is impossible," Michael panted. "We were just here. Our stuff, the car," I said. "The road. We need to find the road." But when we looked around the clearing, there was no sign of where we'd driven in. No tire tracks, no gap in the trees, nothing. Just forest stretching endlessly in every direction. Michael played his flashlight beam around the tree line. "There," he said. "I think I see a path." Gee, it was barely visible. Just a slight depression in the forest floor that might have been a game trail. But it was something. A direction to go that wasn't just aimless wandering. We started walking. The path wound through the trees like a snake, sometimes barely visible, sometimes opening into what might charitably be called a trail. We walked for what felt like hours, our flashlights growing dimmer as the batteries drained. That's when we heard Kevin calling for help. His voice was coming from somewhere to our left, off the path, deeper in the forest. He sounded hurt, desperate. "Stephen! Michael! Help me! I'm trapped!" Michael started to head toward the voice, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I said. "Think about it. Kevin left the campsite on his own, remember? He walked off into the forest like he knew exactly where he was going. But what if he's really hurt? What if he's not Kevin?" The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, I can see your lights. There's something wrong with my leg." Michael wavered, torn between basic human decency and the growing certainty that nothing in this forest was what it seemed. That's when we saw the other flashlight. It was moving through the trees toward us, bobbing with the motion of someone walking quickly. In the distance, we could just make out a human figure. "Thank God," the voice called out. It was definitely Kevin's voice, Kevin's inflection. I've been wandering around for hours. Got turned around in the dark." The figure got closer, and in the weak beam of our flashlights we could see that it was indeed Kevin. Same clothes, same face, same easy smile. He looked completely normal except for one thing. He was walking backwards. Not walking backward like someone who was retreating or being careful, but walking backward like that was his natural method of locomotion. His body was facing away from us, but his head was turned around 180 degrees so he could see where he was going. "Did you guys find the others?" Kevin asked, his backwards head smiling that familiar smile. "I heard screaming earlier. Sounded like it was coming from the creek." Michael made a sound like a wounded animal and started to run. I was right behind him, crashing through the underbrush as the thing that looked like Kevin called after us in Kevin's voice. "Where are you going? We need to stick together. It's not safe out here." We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out, finally collapsing against the massive trunk of a ponderosa pine. In the distance, we could still hear Kevin calling for us, but the voice seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, as if there were several Kevins wandering through the forest. "What the hell is happening?" Michael gasped. "What are those things?" I didn't have an answer. Nothing in my 34 years of life had prepared me for this. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that there had to be a logical explanation. Hallucinations brought on by altitude sickness, carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty camp stove, some kind of elaborate prank. But I'd seen Ashley's backwards feet. I'd seen Kevin's neck twisted around like an owl's. I'd seen too many teeth in Jennifer's mouth. "We need to keep moving," I said. "Find the road. Find help." "What road?" Michael laughed bitterly. "We've been walking for hours. There is no road. There never was a road." He was right, and I knew it. The GPS had malfunctioned the moment we'd entered this part of the forest. The car had been sabotaged, but by what? The Kevin thing had disconnected the battery cables, but that implied the real Kevin had been replaced before we'd even made camp. How long had it been wearing his face? "The hammering," I said suddenly. "That rhythmic hammering we heard. It wasn't random." Michael looked at me with hollow eyes. "What do you mean?" 3 raps, pause, 3 raps. It's a pattern, a signal. Signal for what? Before I could answer, we heard it again. The hammering sound, but closer now. And this time, I could tell it wasn't hammering at all. It was footsteps. Something was walking through the forest with a heavy, deliberate gait that shook the ground with each step. The rhythm was what we'd been hearing. Step, step, step. Pause, step, step, step. "We need to hide," I whispered. We crawled behind the massive pine trunk just as whatever was making those footsteps came into view. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, and walked upright like a man but moved with the fluid grace of a predator. In the weak moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could see that its skin was dark and leathery, stretched over a frame that was too thin and too angular to be human. Its arms hung nearly to the ground, ending in hands with too many fingers. But the worst part was its face. It was Kevin's face, but wrong. Stretched and distorted like a rubber mask that didn't quite fit. The features were in the right places, but the proportions were off. The skin too loose. The smile too wide. The thing stopped walking and turned its head toward our hiding place. I held my breath, certain it could hear my heartbeat thundering in my chest. "Stephen," it called in Kevin's voice. "Michael, I know you're here. I can smell your fear." It started walking again, but not away from us. Toward us. "The old ones are hungry," it continued conversationally, as if we were still sitting around the campfire sharing stories. "They've been sleeping for so long, dreaming of meat and bone and the sweet taste of terror. You woke them up when you crossed the threshold." Michael grabbed my arm, his fingernails digging into my skin. The thing was only about 20 feet away now, close enough that I could hear its breathing, wet and labored, like a broken bellows. "They showed me the truth," the Kevin thing said, "peeled off my skin like wrapping paper and showed me what I really am underneath. Would you like to see?" It reached up and grabbed its face with those 2 long fingers. There was a wet, tearing sound, and Kevin's face came away like a mask, revealing something underneath that my mind refused to process. Too many eyes, too many teeth, angles that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Michael screamed. The thing's head snapped toward the sound and it let out a roar that shook pine needles from the trees above us. Then it was moving, covering the distance between us in 3 impossibly long strides. I grabbed Michael and hauled him to his feet and we ran again. Behind us, the thing gave chase, crashing through the underbrush with those heavy, measured footsteps. We ran deeper into the forest, away from any hope of finding a road or help or anything resembling civilization. The trees grew thicker, older, their trunks so massive they blocked out the moon. It was like running through a cathedral made of wood and shadow, where the only light came from our dying flashlights. That's when I saw the cabin. It was small and built of weathered logs, with a stone chimney that stretched up into the darkness. Warm, yellow light spilled from its windows and I could see smoke rising from the chimney. "There," I gasped, pointing. "That's people. Help." We stumbled toward the cabin, hope flooding through me for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Real people meant real help, meant a phone or radio or at least somewhere to hide until dawn. Michael pounded on the door while I looked back toward the tree line, expecting to see the thing that wore Kevin's face come crashing through at any moment. The door opened, revealing a woman in her 60s with graying hair and kind eyes. She was wearing a faded flannel shirt and jeans, and she looked exactly like someone's grandmother. "Please," Michael gasped. "We need help. Our friends are missing, and there's something in the forest." "Of course, dear," the woman said, stepping aside to let us in. Come in, come in. You look half frozen." The interior of the cabin was exactly what you'd expect. Handmade furniture, a crackling fire in the stone fireplace, the smell of coffee and wood smoke. It felt safe and warm and blessedly normal. "Sit by the fire," the woman said. "I'll get you some coffee. You can tell me what happened." We collapsed into chairs by the fireplace while the woman busied herself in the kitchen area. I could hear her moving around, opening cabinets and filling a kettle. "Thank God," Michael whispered. "I thought we were going to die out there." I nodded, but something was bothering me. It took me a moment to figure out what it was. The woman hadn't asked our names. She hadn't asked how we'd found her cabin or where we'd come from. She'd just invited us in like she'd been expecting us. "Ma'am," I called out, "how long have you lived here?" "Oh, a very long time," she replied from the kitchen. "Since before the forest changed." "Changed how?" She appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with 2 steaming mugs. "It got hungry," she said simply. As she approached, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Her feet were bare, and they were pointing backwards. "Michael," I whispered, but it was too late. The woman smiled, and I saw too many teeth. "You're just in time for dinner," she said. The mugs crashed to the floor as Michael and I lunged for the door, but it wouldn't open. The handle turned, but the door wouldn't budge, as if it were sealed shut. Now, the woman said, and her voice was changing, becoming deeper and more resonant. "Where are your manners? I've prepared such a lovely meal." I looked toward the kitchen and saw them. Pieces of people arranged on plates like cuts of meat. A familiar green eyes stared sightlessly from a severed head that might once have been Ashley. The woman was changing too, her skin stretching and darkening, her limbs elongating until she was no longer remotely human. The cabin itself was changing, the warm wood walls becoming black stone, the cheerful fire becoming an altar surrounded by bones. "The old ones are hungry," she said in a voice like grinding stone. "And you called them by crossing the threshold, by speaking their names around the fire, by feeding them your fear." Michael was pounding on the door, screaming for help that would never come. I looked around desperately for another way out and saw a window on the far side of the room. "Michael!" I shouted. "The window!" We grabbed a chair and smashed it through the glass, then dove through the opening as the thing that had been an old woman let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal. We landed hard on the rocky ground outside and ran into the forest. Behind us, the cabin was dissolving like smoke, fading into nothingness until there was nothing but trees and darkness. We ran until we couldn't run anymore, then walked, then stumbled, supporting each other through the maze of pine and shadow. The forest seemed infinite, stretching on forever in every direction. Dawn came slowly, a gradual lightening of the darkness that revealed we were walking through a grove of aspens whose leaves whispered secrets in a language I didn't want to understand. "Look," Michael croaked, pointing ahead. It was a road, not the dirt track we'd driven in on, but a real paved road with yellow lines down the middle. We stumbled toward it like drowning men reaching for a life preserver. A state police car was parked on the shoulder. The officer who got out was middle-aged and professional, with graying hair and tired eyes. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be. A cop who'd seen too much and just wanted to finish his shift. "You boys look like you've had a rough night," he said. "What happened?" Michael and I looked at each other, trying to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. "Our friends," I finally said. "They're missing, back in the forest. We need search and rescue." The officer frowned. "What forest?" "Son, this is Interstate 25, 20 miles south of Socorro. Nearest trees are 50 miles west of here." I turned around to look back the way we'd come, expecting to see the wall of ponderosa pines we'd just emerged from. There was nothing but open desert stretching to the horizon. "That's impossible," Michael said. "We just came from the Gila wilderness. There was a cabin and things that looked like our friends and—" "Easy there," the officer said. "You boys been drinking? Using any substances?" "No," I said desperately. "Officer, our friends are dead. Jennifer Williams, Ashley Robinson, Kevin King. They were killed by something in the forest." The officer pulled out a notepad. "When did you last see these friends?" "Last night. We were camping, and they disappeared one by one, and then these things that looked like them—" "Son," the officer interrupted gently, "what's today's date?" I stared at him. "October 15th. "It's October 20th, he said. "You've been missing for 5 days." I felt the world tilt sideways. "That's impossible." "According to the missing person report filed by your employer, you and 4 co-workers left Albuquerque last Friday for a camping trip in the Gila. When you didn't return on Sunday, they called us. We've had search teams combing that forest for 3 days." "Did they find anything?" Michael asked. The officer's expression grew grim. "We found your vehicle on a Forest Service road about 6 miles from the main highway. All your camping gear was still inside, but no sign of any of you." "What about the others? Jennifer, Ashley, Kevin?" "No sign of them either, just you two, walking out of the desert in the middle of nowhere." He gave us water and called for an ambulance, then drove us to the nearest hospital where doctors poked and prodded us and asked the same questions over and over. How had we gotten to the interstate? Where had we been for 5 days? What happened to our friends? We told the truth, but of course no one believed us. The official conclusion was that we'd suffered some kind of shared psychotic break brought on by dehydration and exposure. The fact that we'd somehow traveled 50 miles from where our car was found without shoes or water or any memory of the journey was explained away as a symptom of severe disorientation. The search for our friends continued for another week before being called off. They were declared dead in absentia, victims of a wilderness accident. Their families held memorial services. The company sent flowers. But I know the truth. I know that somewhere in the Gila wilderness, in a place that doesn't appear on any map, there's a clearing where creatures wearing human faces wait around a fire that never goes out. They're patient, these old ones, content to wait for the next group of campers to cross the threshold and speak their names in the darkness. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I hear that rhythmic hammering again. 3 raps, pause, 3 raps. Getting closer. I never camp anymore. I live in the city now, in a high-rise apartment with deadbolts and security cameras and neighbors on all sides. But sometimes I catch a glimpse of familiar faces in crowds. Jennifer's auburn hair disappearing around a corner, Ashley's green eyes watching me from across a restaurant, Kevin's easy smile in the reflection of a storefront window. They're calling to me, inviting me back to the forest where the old ones hunger and the trees whisper secrets in languages older than human speech. But I won't go back. I can't, because deep down, in the part of my mind that still remembers the taste of that animal fear, I know the truth about what happened to us in those 5 missing days. We never left the forest at all. We're still there, around that fire, taking turns sharing our deepest fears while something that looks like Kevin smiles with too many teeth and tells us that the old ways are better. And someday, when the boundaries between worlds grow thin again, I'll stop fighting and let myself remember what I really am underneath this human mask I wear. The hammering is getting louder now. 3 raps. Pause. 3 raps. It's almost time. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 29 years old. This happened in the Gila Wilderness of southwestern New Mexico, in a place so remote that even the ravens seem to avoid it. It was supposed to be a celebration. My promotion at the accounting firm, finally making senior analyst after 3 grueling years. My college friends agreed to a long weekend camping trip, just like the old days. Kevin Young, my roommate from freshman year, suggested the Gila. Completely off-grid, he'd said with that crooked grin of his. No cell towers, no tourists, just us in the wilderness. The others were enthusiastic. Amanda Wright, who'd been dealing with her divorce and needed to get away from everything. Christopher Hernandez, our perpetual optimist who saw adventure in every shadow. And Rachel Rogers, the practical one who always overpacked but somehow made everything work. We drove from Albuquerque in 2 vehicles, Kevin and Chris in Kevin's Jeep, while Amanda, Rachel, and I took my Honda. The last gas station was in Reserve, a dying town where the attendant looked at us like we were driving toward our own funeral. "Gila's been strange this year," the old man had muttered, not meeting our eyes. "Folks going in, not all of them coming back out the same." Amanda laughed it off. "A small town superstition," she said, but I noticed her voice carried a slight tremor. The drive to the trailhead took another hour on increasingly rough roads. By the time we reached the parking area, a small dirt lot carved from the forest, the sun was already dipping toward the horizon, painting the ponderosa pines in shades of amber and rust. We'd planned to hike 2 miles to a clearing Kevin had found on satellite maps beside a creek that supposedly ran year-round. The trail was barely visible, more of a game path winding through dense forest. Ancient trees towered above us, their branches intertwining to form a canopy so thick that even at 5 in the evening, the forest floor existed in perpetual twilight. "This place gives me the creeps," Rachel admitted after we'd been hiking for 30 minutes. Her voice seemed swallowed by the oppressive silence around us. No bird songs, no insect buzzing, just the crunch of our boots on dried pine needles and the occasional groan of wind through branches. "It's just quiet," Chris said, ever the optimist, but even he kept glancing over his shoulder. Kevin led the way with his GPS device, though I noticed him frowning at it more frequently as we progressed. "The readings are weird," he muttered when I caught up to him. "Says we've been walking northeast for 20 minutes, but I swear we've been heading due north." By the time we reached the clearing, darkness was falling faster than it should have. The space was perfect. A circular meadow perhaps 50 yards across with the promised creek gurgling along its eastern edge. But something felt wrong about it. The grass was too uniform, too green, as if it had been deliberately maintained. Ancient stones formed a rough circle near the center, weathered smooth and covered in lichen that looked almost like symbols in the dying light. "Stone circle," Amanda observed, dropping her pack near the edge. "Probably old Native American ceremonial site." "Navajo," Kevin said with authority he didn't possess. "This whole area used to be their hunting grounds." I wanted to correct him. We were actually in traditional Apache territory, and the Navajo had their own complex relationship with this region. But something about the place made me want to speak as little as possible. Every word seemed to echo strangely, as if the clearing were a natural amphitheater designed to carry sound beyond our small group. We set up camp in the fading light, our LED lanterns pushing back shadows that seemed reluctant to retreat. The tents went up without incident, though Kevin's GPS continued to malfunction, displaying readings that made no sense. Mine was completely dead, though I'd charged it the night before. "Cell phones?" Amanda asked, holding hers up toward the canopy. "Dead zone," Rachel confirmed, checking her own device. "Not even emergency signals." Chris attempted to lighten the mood by building our campfire in the stone circle. "Might as well use what's here," he said, though his usual enthusiasm sounded forced. The stones seemed to amplify the fire's heat in strange ways, one side roasting us while the other remained cold despite our proximity. That first night, the dreams began. I found myself standing at the edge of the clearing, watching figures move between the trees. They walked upright like humans, but their proportions were wrong. Limbs too long, joints bending in directions that violated anatomy. When I tried to call out to my friends, my voice produced no sound. The figures noticed my silence and began moving toward me with a fluid gait that suggested muscles and bones that didn't quite follow mammalian rules. I woke, gasping, the sound unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn stillness. My digital watch read 3:33 a.m., but something about that felt artificial, as if time itself were being manipulated. The fire had died to embers, which should have been impossible given how much wood Chris had piled on before we turned in. Looking around the camp, I could see my friends' tents, but I couldn't hear breathing, snoring, or any of the small sounds sleeping people make. The silence was so complete it felt hostile. That's when I noticed the prints. Circling our campsite just beyond the reach of the dying firelight, bare footprints were pressed into the soft earth. Human-shaped but wrong. Too long, with gaps between the toes that suggested webbing or claws. They formed a perfect circle around us, as if something had spent hours walking the perimeter, watching us sleep. I wanted to wake the others, but something primitive in my brain screamed against making any noise. Instead, I lay rigid in my sleeping bag until dawn, listening for movement that never came. Morning brought no relief. The prints were gone, smoothed away as if they'd never existed, but the wrongness remained. Kevin emerged from his tent looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes. "Did anyone else have fucked up dreams?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I dreamed about my ex-husband," Amanda said, poking at the cold ashes of our fire. "But he was different, stretched out, like someone had pulled him through a taffy machine." Rachel and Chris looked equally disturbed, though neither wanted to discuss details. We ate breakfast in relative silence, occasionally commenting on the strange quality of the light. Too dim for full daylight, too bright for the heavy canopy above us. "GPS is completely fried," Kevin announced, holding up his device. "Shows us in 3 different locations simultaneously." "Same with the emergency beacon," Rachel added. "It's transmitting, but the readout says it's been transmitting for 6 days. We only arrived yesterday." We decided to explore the area, partly to shake off the night's unease and partly because the alternative, sitting in that oppressive clearing, felt unbearable. Chris volunteered to gather firewood while the rest of us followed the creek upstream to look for a swimming hole Amanda thought she'd spotted the evening before. The creek led us deeper into the forest, away from anything resembling a trail. The water moved strangely, flowing uphill in places and forming whirlpools where the current should have been straight. Rachel, ever practical, knelt to test the temperature and immediately jerked her hand back. "It's warm," she said, confusion and disgust mingling in her voice. "Like bath water, and it smells—" I caught the scent then, metallic and organic, like old blood mixed with something that might have been decay. The smell was subtle enough that we might have missed it if we hadn't been paying attention, but once noticed, it seemed to permeate everything. We found Chris an hour later, standing motionless beside a massive dead pine about a quarter-mile from camp. He was facing away from us, shoulders rigid, holding an armload of branches that looked oddly uniform, as if they'd been deliberately selected rather than gathered randomly. "Chris," Amanda called out, but he didn't respond. We approached cautiously. Something about his posture triggered every prey instinct we'd inherited from our ancestors. He stood too still, breathing too quietly, and when we circled around to face him, his expression was empty. Not unconscious, not confused, but vacant in a way that suggested the lights were on, but nobody was home. "Hey, man, you okay?" Kevin reached out to touch his shoulder. Chris turned toward us with mechanical precision, and I saw that his eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire visible portion of his eyeballs, as if they'd been filled with ink. He smiled then, and his teeth were wrong. Too many of them, crowded into his mouth like a shark's. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made my bones ache. "I found something wonderful," he said, and his words seemed to come from inside my skull rather than through my ears. "Do you want to see?" Without waiting for an answer, he turned and began walking deeper into the forest, moving with a fluid gait that reminded me of my dream figures. His feet made no sound on the forest floor, and the branches he carried cast no shadows despite the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. "We have to follow him," Amanda whispered, though every rational part of my brain screamed against it. "The hell we do," Kevin shot back, but he was already moving in Chris's direction. We followed because the alternative was leaving him alone with whatever had gotten into him. The forest seemed to close around us as we walked, branches reaching across the barely visible path, roots rising to catch our feet. My watch had stopped working, hands frozen at 11:47, though the light suggested it was mid-afternoon. Chris led us to a depression in the forest floor, a natural bowl perhaps 30 feet across, filled with objects that didn't belong. Camping gear, but not modern equipment. Canvas tents from decades past, rusted camp stoves, sleeping bags that had rotted away to reveal bones inside, and scattered among the decay, personal effects. Wallets, jewelry, photographs faded beyond recognition. "People have been disappearing here for a long time," Chris said, his voice still carrying those bone-deep harmonics. "The hungry ones below grow stronger with each feeding." That's when I saw movement in the shadows at the bottom of the depression. Something large shifting among the bones. Something that might once have been human, but had been changed by decades of consumption and transformation. Multiple sets of eyes reflected the filtered sunlight, and I caught glimpses of elongated limbs and faces that had been stretched and reformed into something designed for hunting rather than social interaction. "Chris," Rachel said carefully, "we need to go back to camp. Something's wrong with this place." He turned to face us again, and I realized that whatever was looking out through his eyes wasn't Chris anymore. It might wear his face and speak with his voice, but the consciousness behind those black eyes belonged to something else entirely. "Nothing's wrong," he said. "Everything's perfect. You just need to see properly." He began walking toward us, and I noticed that his feet weren't quite touching the ground. The thing wearing Chris's body was floating, just barely, moving with the fluid grace of something unbound by human musculature and skeletal limitations. We ran. The forest fought us every step of the way. Branches struck at our faces, roots caught our ankles, and the very ground seemed to shift beneath our feet. Behind us, I could hear Chris calling out in that harmonically impossible voice, words in a language that predated human speech but somehow conveyed meaning directly into our minds. "Come back. Join us. Feed the hungry ones." We burst into the clearing gasping and terror-stricken, but even our campsite no longer felt safe. The stone circle seemed larger than before, and symbols I hadn't noticed were now clearly visible on each weathered surface, carved spirals and angular shapes that hurt to look at directly. "We have to leave," Amanda said, already breaking down her tent. "Right now." But when we looked toward the forest edge where we'd entered, there was no path. The tree line was solid, unbroken, as if the trail we'd followed had never existed. Kevin tried to force his way through the undergrowth but found the vegetation impossibly dense, branches and thorns intertwined so tightly that even a chainsaw would have struggled to cut through. "There has to be another way out," Rachel said, though her voice carried no conviction. We spent the afternoon searching the clearing's perimeter, but the forest wall was impenetrable. As evening approached, we were forced to accept that we were trapped, at least until morning. Maybe the path would reappear with daylight. Maybe whatever was happening would weaken when the sun rose. As darkness fell, we huddled around a fire built in the stone circle, though none of us wanted to use the ancient formation. The flames burned with colors that didn't quite match normal combustion, blues and greens that flickered at the edges of perception. That's when Chris emerged from the tree line. He looked exactly as he had when we'd fled, but now he moved with complete silence, his feet definitely not touching the ground. Those black eyes reflected our firelight like a nocturnal predator's, and when he smiled, I could see that his teeth had multiplied further, filling his mouth in overlapping rows. "I've been waiting for you to understand," he said, settling onto a stone across the fire from us. "This place is special. The Hungry Ones have been here much longer than human civilization, much longer than the tribes who learned to avoid this valley. They feed on life force, on the electrical impulses that animate flesh, but they need willing participants to truly feast." "Chris," Amanda tried, though we all knew it wasn't really him anymore. "Fight whatever's controlling you. You're still in there somewhere." The thing wearing Chris's face tilted its head with mechanical precision. Christopher offered himself willingly once he understood. The visions I showed him, the knowledge of what lies beneath this place, what has always lain beneath. He wanted to join us. It gestured toward the stone circle, and I realized that the symbols weren't carved into the rock. They were burned in, as if tremendous heat had melted the mineral surface into new configurations. "Each stone marks a feeding," it continued. "Each symbol represents a group that chose to stay, to become part of something larger than individual consciousness. You could be the next." Kevin grabbed a burning branch from the fire, holding it like a weapon. "Stay the fuck away from us." The Chris thing laughed, a sound like wind chimes made from bone. "Fire won't help you. Physical resistance is pointless. We don't want your bodies. We want your permission." That's when I understood. Whatever these entities were, they operated under rules. They couldn't simply take what they wanted. They needed consent, needed us to choose to feed ourselves to the hungry ones below. Everything, the isolation, the fear, the mounting wrongness, was designed to break down our resistance until joining them seemed preferable to fighting. "We'll never give permission," Rachel said firmly. "You will," the thing replied with absolute certainty. "Because the alternative is remaining here forever, slowly starving, slowly going mad, while we show you exactly what happens to those who refuse our gift." It raised one hand, and the forest around us filled with sounds. Screaming, weeping, voices calling for help in languages both familiar and unknown. The sounds came from beneath the earth, as if the ground were a thin shell covering vast spaces filled with the tormented remains of previous visitors. "Every person who's disappeared in these mountains over the past century," it explained conversationally. "They're all here, all aware, all suffering, but they no longer have bodies capable of death, so their agony continues indefinitely." The sounds intensified, and I could make out individual words. "Help me. Please. Make it stop," repeated in dozens of voices, some still recognizably human, others distorted by what sounded like decades of screaming. Amanda broke first. "Stop," she sobbed, covering her ears. "Please, just make it stop." "Simply ask to join us," the Chris thing said gently. "Ask to become part of our family, and the suffering ends. For them and for you." I realized we were facing something far older and more patient than human civilization, something that had perfected the art of psychological manipulation over millennia. But there had to be a way out. There was always a way out. That's when I noticed Kevin staring at the stone circle with intense concentration. He caught my eye and mouthed a single word. "Salt." Of course, Rachel's overpacking. She'd brought enough supplies for a week, including seasoning for camp meals. If these things operated under supernatural rules, maybe traditional protections would work. While the Chris thing continued its psychological assault, describing in vivid detail what awaited us if we refused its offer, Kevin quietly signaled to Rachel. She understood immediately, reaching into her pack with trembling hands. The entity noticed the movement and turned toward her with inhuman speed. "What are you?" Kevin threw the entire shaker of salt directly into its face. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The Chris thing shrieked, a sound that made our earlier terror seem quaint by comparison. Its borrowed features began to melt and run like wax, revealing something underneath that violated every principle of anatomy and physics. Multiple eyes, limbs that bent in impossible directions, and a mouth that opened far too wide, lined with teeth that appeared to be made from some kind of crystalline material. The screaming from beneath the earth intensified, and I felt the ground shudder as if massive forms were shifting in underground caverns. But the salt had broken whatever hold the entity had on this particular manifestation, and it began to dissolve. Chris's hijacked body collapsing into component elements that scattered on a wind that carried the stench of sulfur and decay. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the screaming. Even the fire had gone out, leaving us in absolute darkness. "We have to find the real Chris," Amanda whispered. I knew we wouldn't find him alive, but we had to try. Using our remaining flashlights, we searched the clearing until Kevin found a section of ground that looked different, softer, recently disturbed. We dug with our hands and camp tools until we uncovered what remained of our friend. Chris's body was intact but completely drained, like a deflated balloon. His skin was paper-thin and translucent, his eyes clouded white. But worst of all, he was still breathing, shallow, labored gasps that suggested consciousness without the capacity to act or speak. "Jesus Christ," Kevin breathed. "They left him aware." Whatever these entities were, they fed on life force but left their victims conscious during the process, probably to maximize the terror and despair they could harvest. Chris had been alive and aware while that thing wore his face, trapped inside his own draining body. We couldn't help him. Even if we could somehow get him to a hospital, no medical intervention could restore what had been taken. But we couldn't leave him like this either. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and Kevin handed me a heavy stone from the circle. The act was mercy, but it felt like murder. Chris's suffering ended with a sound like paper tearing, and we buried him properly while dawn broke over the Gila wilderness. The path reappeared with the sunrise, exactly where it had been originally. We packed our remaining gear in silence and began the hike back to our vehicles, each of us carrying trauma that would never fully heal. But we weren't alone on the trail. All around us, barely visible in the morning light, translucent figures walked among the trees. Men, women, children. People who had disappeared over the decades, still wandering the forest in some form between life and death. They watched us pass with expressions of infinite sadness, and I understood that Chris would soon join their ranks, another spirit trapped in this place of feeding and hunger. We reached our cars without incident, though my Honda's engine took several tries to start, as if the vehicle had been drained of electrical power during our absence. The drive back to civilization passed in oppressive silence, each of us lost in private hells that no one else could fully understand. At the hospital in Albuquerque, we tried to explain Chris's disappearance to the authorities, but our story fell apart under questioning. Search and rescue teams found no trace of him in the areas we described, and the GPS coordinates Kevin provided led to empty forest with no signs of human presence. The official report listed Christopher Hernandez as a missing person, presumed dead after becoming separated from his group during a wilderness hiking trip. Case closed, file archived, family notified of their loss. But I know the truth. I know that Chris is still out there, walking endlessly through the Gila wilderness, conscious but powerless, watching as new groups of hikers venture into territories they don't understand. I know that something ancient and hungry waits beneath that cursed clearing, growing stronger with each feeding, patient as only immortal things can be patient. And I know that every night, in the moments between waking and sleep, I can hear Chris calling my name. The thing that terrifies me most is that part of me wants to answer. Part of me wants to drive back to New Mexico, hike that unmarked trail, and surrender to whatever waits in the stone circle. Because sometimes joining the hungry ones seems preferable to carrying this knowledge alone. 3 months have passed since our camping trip. Amanda has started seeing a therapist but won't discuss what happened in the forest. Kevin moved to Seattle and changed his phone number. Rachel sends occasional emails asking if I'm okay, but we never talk about that weekend. Sometimes I dream about the clearing, about the stone circle and the symbols burned into ancient rock. In these dreams, Chris stands among the other lost souls, still wearing that empty smile, still speaking in harmonics that bypass the ears and resonate directly in bone and sinew. "Come back," he says in these dreams. "Join us. Feed the hungry ones." And the worst part is that I'm starting to consider it, because the alternative, living with this knowledge, carrying this guilt, being the sole keeper of a truth that no one will believe, feels like its own form of eternal torment. The Gila wilderness is still there, still remote, still waiting. The hungry ones below are still patient, still feeding on the occasional hiker who ventures too far from marked trails. And Chris is still calling my name, his voice carried on winds that blow all the way to my apartment in Albuquerque. I've been looking at maps lately, planning routes back to that unmarked parking area, that barely visible trail, that clearing where ancient stones mark feeding grounds older than human civilization. Because sometimes surrender looks like peace, and that terrifies me more than anything else.